Okay, I think we can start because Professor Egidius Alexandravicius he's coming and he's apologizing being a bit late, but I think we can start while we are presenting each other. Some other people will join us. So firstly, I would like to introduce myself. My name is Vaidotas Vaičaitis. I'm Associate Professor at Vilnius University Faculty of Law. And first of all, I would like to welcome everybody to this event. I think for us it is very important, and I think for all the issues we will see during our seminar and conference. Let us call it like this. Firstly, probably two sentences why this seminar is organized and who is organizing. Probably you have seen that this is organized somehow by faculties of law or by lawyers. And why lawyers? A friend of mine, Tomasz, the very last year, asked me whether it is possible to organize something not from the legal, only from legal point of view, while we are talking a lot of ethnicity issues, especially concerning the judgments and decisions of constitutional courts, administrative courts, European courts. But somehow we have an impression that this is not about the law, or not only about the law, yes? This is something which pre-exists us, probably. This is something which is in our mentality, in our way of thinking. And only then we have these legal solutions, taking all different issues, for instance, the spelling letters in our passports or in the names of the streets or whatever. And I think it is a right thing to accept that probably if some ethnicity groups have certain tensions, probably there is something in the history needed to be discussed, needed to be opened. And this is very modest attempt to do it. Let's say probably to accept that we probably have Polish and Lithuanian ethnicity groups. Probably we do have a certain warmth in the history, and I think they need to be healed. But in order to be healed, probably they need to be revealed. Yes. So we will try to do our best, I think, in this very small, modest seminar. So the very structure of the seminar you can see in the program. The first session is devoted to our historians. Firstly, we will speak Professor Leszek Zasztow from Polish Academy of Science, Warsaw, and he will speak on the issues, some critical remarks on origin of Poles in historic Lithuania. And Professor Egidius Alexandravicius also will give a perspective, historic perspectives of Polish-Lithuanian relationships from, let's say, Lithuanian part. And so this is the first session, let's say, historic one. And after coffee break, we have two other speakers which will be presented by Dr. Tomasz Milej, and they will speak from the point of view of, let's say, ethnic studies and national minority studies. So this is the very structure. But first of all, probably somebody would like to welcome the seminar or conference, if there is anybody. No? Then we can start with Professor Leszek Zasztow, Polish Academy of Science. I would like you to ask to come over here, and I would like you to ask to present yourself a bit, your academic background, just to know more about it.
At first information, I'm not only a professor in the Polish Academy of Sciences, in which I'm, to say precisely, I'm director of the Institute for the History of Science of Ludwig and Alexander Birkenmeier, named by those famous Polish historians of science, but also I work at the Warsaw University in the Center for East European Studies, so the ethnicity and the ethnic problems are for me, let's say, the core of my interests, of my research. So I have changed the title of my expose here, and the title is Old Lithuanians. Old Lithuanians is quite important issue now in historical studies, so I'm going to show you what I think about this term and this phenomenon. But before I start, I would like to show you the latest books about Vilnius. The first one is written by Karolina Sołtys. This is the PhD thesis about Józef Ignacy Kraszewski as a historian, and subtitle is Scientific Base of the Lectures about the History of Lithuania in the Monograph of Vilnius. Kraszewski wrote at the beginning of his literary career 4 volumes monograph about Vilnius. And that was only one scientific book which was written by this famous writer, Polish writer. So this is to show to the people. But this is a small one. But this is the big one. This is the really big one book, because this is the, let's say, not only opera magna, opus vitae, I think, even, of this professor David Frick. David Frick was, as far as I remember, one month ago in Vilnius, and he invited by the American embassy here, and was the promotion of this book here in Vilnius. I see that ladies have seen it. And this is the main book, in my opinion, in his bibliography. And this is exactly, the title is Kin and Neighbors, Communities and Confession in 17th Century Vilna. But he used the word Vilna, as you can see, as in Polish. But this is the use of this name in the 17th century, which is the most popular. And this is a very important book, in my opinion, for the lawyers and the historians of law, because this is the picture of Vilnius in the first half of the 17th century, which was the most tolerant town, or let's say one of the most tolerant towns, cities in 17th century Europe, comparable with the Italian towns, the most famous. And so this is the book which I get back to this book, but I show you. But please give me it back. Yes, I know. I try to read it because the text has 11 pages, then maybe I should make some abbreviations. The concept of Old Lithuanians, introduced into the scholarly literature by Krzysztof Bochowski and popularized by Professor Alfredas Bumblauskas, gained significant popularity not only in Poland, but first of all in the Lithuanian intellectual milieu. The term seems to be sympathetic, meaningful, and earned even some warm appreciation also in the Polish historical circles. Although, one should stress that this concept is not as fresh and new as it seems. Before Buchowski's book was published, we had a very useful idea of Lithuanian in the old sense of the word, called Polish biculture, popularized by Czesław Miłosz to define some people who descend from historic Lithuania, contemporary Lithuania and Belarus. There was a lot of such old sense Lithuanians, as for example the rank of personages from a previous century, as Zygmunt Jundził, Wiktor Sukiennicki, Stanisław Sianiewicz, Kazimierz Okulicz, Stanisław Kościołkowski, Władysław Wielchorski, and many others. To some extent, this concept covered also a unique personality of the master, Czesław Miłosz himself. So the idea of Lithuanians in the old sense of the word was present since 1950s and 1960s, and probably has emerged much earlier, at least since the beginning of the 20th century, when the national tensions started to be apparent here. This concept, similar to other sociolinguistic terms, mirrors the reality to only a certain degree. It aims at interpreting the real state of affairs in historical Lithuania, concerning the origins of the significant part of its inhabitants who at the end of the 19th century and at the beginning of the 20th century defined themselves as a Poles. The word themselves as a local Poles. The word local seems to be a crucial key to understand the whole issue. By the way, it also explains the specific feature of the Belarusian identity on that territories. On the other hand, it also creates a specific feature or phenomenon of a certain misty atmosphere around this group of people from Lithuania, who, to say it frankly, might be simply defined as a human being of Polish descent. In other words, it weakens and dilutes firm national divisions which were apparent or just started to be clearly visible at the end of the 19th century on the territories of the former Grand Duchy of Lithuania. Using this expression was a kind of assent to create a new socio-ethnical category, which in fact tried to deprive to some extent those old Lithuanians of their national character. Nevertheless, Polish are, for example, Belarusian. One of the first scholars who pointed out this issue was Juliusz Bardach in his renowned text about the multi-level consciousness of Poles in historic Lithuania in the 19th-20th century. So, who were those strange people? They were Poles, but with a certain Lithuanian past, which must be interpreted as a solid Lithuanian roots from the ancient historical era. These roots were in the modern times lost, but the genetic and ethnic links survived, even while those bonds were unconscious and unarticulated by those newly created figures in their fresh ethnic category. One of the specific charts of the consciousness of those speaking Polish Old Lithuanians was their aversion to the neighboring Poles from the Congress Kingdom of Poland, created in 1815, who were treated as close brothers, but in common opinion they were unquestionably on a lower level of their civilizational status. They represented a pure Polish milieu, in the form of the Piast dynasty tradition, while the Old Lithuanians were settled in their glorious, multinational and all-embracing Jagiellonian past. This was the tradition of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, the powerful state located in the heart of Europe, settled from the Baltic Sea on the north to Black Sea on the south. This Jagiellonian and the Grand Duchy idea, in their opinion, was much more significant, much older, even with the Roman roots, and of course much better than the simple old Polish tradition represented by the kings like Mieszko, Bolesław Chrobry, not to mention about the Kazimierz Great. As a result of this approach, a kind of regional sentiments, the post-Commonwealth of two nations feelings, arose up and on the quite incredible scale and have been elevated to the level of nearly vital and national divisions. In this specific way, the term Old Lithuanians enters and opens a kind of Pandora box. It delivers and shakes an opinion that Poles in historic Lithuania were the same Poles as their compatriots living in Poland, ethnic Polish territories, or in any other country of the former Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth after its partitions. In example, in Polish part of Prussia, the Duchy of Poznań, or in Silesia, or in the Austrian Galicia. On the other hand, it fortified and strengthened the Lithuanian ethnic element in the whole social puzzle. Lithuanian ethnic roots are elevated and uplifted to a higher level of understanding and defining the peculiarity of the Polish-speaking group in Lithuania. That was the introduction, so I'm coming to the core. I try to describe my own approach to this sociolinguistic term, and then I try to explain the position of Lithuanians, of Poles, and I try to make a, let's say, short photo of the society, of the people living in historic Lithuania at the threshold of the 19th and 20th century. A Lithuanian approach. As every Lithuanian knows, the model Lithuanian political thought was erected on the remnants of Polish-Lithuanian friendship. The ties between our two nations, constructed and strengthened before 1795, were so strong that strangled the ethnic Lithuanian identity, which was not only in danger, but in fact was captured and subdued by the Polish tradition and customs. Therefore, to create a modern independent Lithuanian nation, the condition sine qua non was the necessity to break those bonds and ties with Poles and Poland. To stay firm against our previous Polish cohabitants was the only direction which guaranteed a chance for victory and a remedy to rebuild the modern nation. That is why Jan Basanowicz preferred to speak Russian than Polish. The Russian language was less dangerous. The concept of Old Lithuanians was in fact present in the modern Lithuanian tradition from its very beginning. That was also a condition sine qua non. The fathers of the Lithuanian national revival were absolutely sure that significant part, or maybe a nearly majority of their beloved Lithuanians, is trapped in the Polish bonds. When the Lithuanian Republic Army was created in 1918, the only language to obey orders and commands was, as enemy says, Polish. After 1918, Lithuanization embraced the whole population of the newly reborn republic and succeeded in a quite short period of time. The ideological foundation for this re-Lithuanization was the concept of historic Lithuania, who lost their national consciousness during the ages. At that decisive moment, no one cared about the real national roots of the inhabitants of the republic. If you were a Pole, or a Belarusian, or a Jew, or of Tatar descent, each person had to and have been equally transformed into the modern Lithuanian citizen. The common platform was of course the language. Summarizing this process of the interwar re-Lithuanization, one must say that on the base of the Lithuanian origins, sometimes treated very artificially, the representatives of many nations of the former Grand Duchy of Lithuania have been recaptured or re-embraced by the modern Lithuanian identity. This phenomenon was probably one of the most spectacular successes of the Republic of Lithuania before 1939. Although no one of its politicians was eager to advertise those actions all around the interwar European public opinion. Although the term Old Lithuanians was not in use at that moment, as far as I know, the concept was fully implemented during the process of creating the modern Lithuanian nation. At the moment of implementing these new ideas, at the beginning of the 20th century, new modern Lithuanians gained the name of the Litvoman, Lithuanian man or maniac, which was defining their position with a negative attitude by their enemies, mostly Lithuanian Poles, who had strongly formulated Polish identity. The modern Lithuanians treated those Poles as Polonizers. This is also the title of Krzysztof Buchowski's book, Litvoman and Polonizers. Looking at the reborn Lithuanian identity after 1918, one might say that it was founded on the concept of conversion of all former nations of the Grand Duchy, Poles and the Old Poles, Belarusian and the Old Belarusians, Russians and the Old Russians, as well as Tatars and the Old Tatars, Jews and any other nationality. And more or less, one must, to admit it frankly, that idea from a point of view of its utility for a new reborn state was brilliant and fully implemented with ultimate success. That's Lithuanian approach, a Polish idea. The concept of Old Lithuanian in some form was also apparent between the Lithuanian Poles at the beginning of the 20th century. Although the term was not in use, the idea was present especially in the circle of the Vilnius so-called locals, Krajowcy. They had been representatives of a non-numerous group of Polish intelligentsia living in historic Lithuania, who foreseen the future of reborn state as, in a specific way, recreated and refurbished former Grand Duchy of Lithuania, which would be in a close cooperation or in a kind of federal alliance with Poland. In identifying themselves with historic Lithuania, they longed for and desired to make a peace agreement between modern Lithuanians, who were focused on the creating of their modern state, and the local Polish community, as well as with the other national ethnic groups descending from the Grand Duchy. Therefore, they aimed at establishing of the common area or an open space for the future alliance between Poland and Lithuanian national identity and the idea of the independent Lithuanian state. Some of them fully accepted the idea of an independent Republic of Lithuania without any preconditions, especially concerning future political or federal ties with Poland. In the ranks of this exclusive representatives of the elite of intellectuals were, among others, Ludwik Abramowicz, Stanisław Narutowicz, Michał Romer, Roman Skirmund, Tadeusz Wróblewski. They might be characterized by their firm anti-nationalistic approach, refusing both the Polish and Lithuanian nationalism as well as Belarusian, Russian or Jewish one. They often defined themselves as democrats in contemporary sense of the word, with a significant dose of tolerance and understanding for aspirations of other nations who were concentrated at establishing their own independent national organism. Some of them were linked with the Vilna Freemasonry. Their main adversary and opponent in the local Polish political environment were the representatives of Polish nationalist movement, the National Democracy, Narodowa Demokracja, which finally overcame and won in Polish political sphere. The Polish-speaking community at the threshold of the 20th century represented all social spheres of the local society. As a kind of social entity, they gradually found themselves under the significant influence of the Józef Piłsudski political philosophy, which expanded and spread the idea of federation of the former national elements of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth Rzeczpospolita. Despite of that, because of the hard condition of the war and especially because the war with Bolsheviks, they gradually changed their position and views and started to be a strong adherents, supporters of the national democracy. In practice, that meant elimination of all other nationalities from this political sphere and establishing a mono-nation structure, an exclusively Polish state, no federation, but one homogeneous state organism. Those who did not turn their views into new direction were mostly intellectuals linked with mentioned circle of Vilna locals. Also, the Polish Socialist Party was at the this historic moment quite influential in Lithuania. How the situation before the First World War might be presented concerning the various strata of the Polish society in Lithuania. Let's make a short observation. Nobility, Polish or Polonized. After the Romans with the Tsarist authorities in the second half of the 19th century, during the short period of the Russian Parliament Duma, 1905-1914, previously loyal to the Russian government, Polish nobility started to be politically separated from any possibility of influence on upcoming events and changes. They did not have any impact on the state of affairs, although they have been en masse more or less conscious of their Lithuanian or Ruthenian roots. The majority of them had been already homogeneously united with the idea of Poland. Its independence was, similarly as during the January uprising of 1863, the main purpose and the crucial political goal for the majority of the gentry. Although it should be stressed that the situation looked differently in various strata of the Lithuanian nobility. The period of a loyal approach to Russia finally ended with when the war broke through. Thus, the aristocracy was cosmopolitan, officially pro-Russian. However, they have been very close to or even fully devoted to the Polish patriotic views, especially to the military and political activity of Piłsudski. Of course, there were exceptions, the people who supported Lithuanian and Belarusian national endeavors, but there were figures literally non-numerous and on the margin of the political mainstream. Also, the aristocracy pro-Russian sympathies ceased quickly to exist during the war. The second part of the nobility, the rich landowners stratum, called the Crimsons, Karmazyny, settled in their broad mansions, although less economically powerful than aristocracy, was also fully devoted in their majority to the idea of the independence of Poland. Because of their ties with other families of the former Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in the ethnic Polish territories, they have been even more pro-Polish in their views than the aristocracy. The aristocracy had a lot of links with the Prussian, Russian and Austrian brothers in arms, let's say. But the most patriotic was the lesser, or gentry, or the petty nobility, which was a fuel for all Polish insurrections since the end of the 18th century to the whole 19th century. Those families gave a huge support for all Polish political factions and parties. In historic Lithuania, the majority of them was more or less linked with the Polish independence movement, which at the end of the 19th century was called the Progressives, or simply niepodległościowcy, the advocates of sovereignty. Predominantly from this circle appeared the most patriotic Polish individuals who in big numbers created a mainstream of the Polish intelligentsia. In those circles was no place for any different way of thinking as to fight for the freedom and independence. They were rebels, revolutionaries educated in a tradition of romantic literature and in the imperative struggle for the revival of Poland. As wrote Michał Romer in his memorandum of 1915. In the landowner sphere of Lithuania, especially between the elements which are far from the politics and less active in the agricultural societies, they preserve a vivid memory of national harm, of the tradition of heroic struggles, national uprisings and the martyrdom. Those traditions are not always a stimulus to act, even that happen very rarely. They are terrorized by the memory of defeats and pressure, which are treated as relics of the ancient sacred past. In general, the nobility circles, nearly all Polish political tendencies were present. But one factor was dominant. That was, as Michał Romer observed, the anti-Russian approach and a significant lack of confidence in any possible alliance with Russia. Also in this case were rare exceptions, as for example the hate and odious Count Adam Górowski, who was commonly acknowledged as a not only Russian zealot but as a simple Tsarist spy, whom in fact he was. Intelligentsia and burghers. Similar tendencies are visible in the ranks of Polish intelligentsia in historic Lithuania. At the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, en masse they followed the general streams of the Polish political thought and played much the same role as petty nobles, with whom they were very close relatives. Medicine doctor, hospital attendants, nursing maids, chemists, private teachers, housekeepers, lower rank officials, lawyers, jurists, stewards of the state, students and high school disciples, but also merchants, shoemakers, butchers, tradesmen, craftsmen, as well as peddlers and chapmen, if they were not of the Jewish origin. They all were at the beginning under the significant influence of the Polish independence movement. This was a nucleus or a core of the newly born Polish middle class at the historic Lithuania. In my opinion, those people were less interested in any national ethnic differences and constituted a typical Polish approach, where was no place for any rethinking of the positions of modern Lithuanians or modern Belarusians. The majority of those people who lived in bigger or smaller Lithuanian and Belarusian towns, gradually at the eve of the First World War was approaching, entered or occupied the position of the Polish national democracy movement, the so-called Ethnicity, the most nationalistic party in political stream. They have been supporters of the idea of an independent Poland, but as a monolithic mono-state constructed and funded by and exclusively for Poles. In general, might be resumed that younger generation was more pro-independence movement orientated, while older generation was more pro-national democratic nationalist stream. This is clearly visible in Michał Romer memorandum of 1915. He noticed that as far as Polish national democracy in Vilna was pro-Russian, they were separated from the mainstream of the society, but when they changed this approach, it resulted in a significant broadening of the group of their supporters. In fact, after 1918, the Ethnicity dominated the Vilna Polish political sphere. Okay, I try to shorten a little bit because I have the fragment now, which is about the peasantry, Polish-speaking peasantry. Maybe a few main ideas. In the ranks of the peasantry living in historic Lithuania, one might find of people of Polish descent, as well as Lithuanians, Ruthenians, Belarusians and Ukrainians, Russians of believers, Karayats, Tatars, probably some more later national ethnic elements. So, Polish-speaking group at the threshold of the 20th century, inside the peasantry, were of the different ethnic roots, not Polish. Very often not Polish. Inside of the Polish-speaking peasantry were farmers from a typical peasant families, but also the representatives of degraded and outcast petty noblemen, called adnadworcy and grażdani of the western provinces of the Russian Empire, who were at the end of the 19th century mostly czynszewiki, farmers who paid their rent after the 1861 end of serfdom. In this milieu there were also peasants from quite wealthy families, equally with the owners of the middle-sized firms, as well as the poor and non-possessing figures. The national ethnic roots were differentiated. There is no adequate research on that issue, but one might agree that they have been partly of the Polish descent, partly of the Lithuanian descent. But the majority was probably Polonized Belarusians, who constituted a significant majority of peasants. Those national divisions were very fluid and flexible and depended very often on the political situation in the country. They often have been a side effect of the political events which overwhelmed the inhabitants of historic Lithuania, as for example the January uprising of 1863 or the 1905 revolution in the empire. Unconditional Belarusian formed the most numerable ethnic group, first of all, on the south and east territories of historic Lithuania. They have been also the most neglected and subordinated social group. They often called themselves locals to run out of the consequences of defining their own nationality. Those locals were nearly always the Orthodox Church supporters, and they were treated by Tsarist authorities as Russians. If they were those Belarusians, if they were a Catholic of Catholic background, they were treated as Poles. The division between the Orthodox Russians and the Catholic Poles was the most visible through the whole 19th century at that territory. The Lithuanian Catholic peasantry started to be isolated and separated and seen by all means from the other by the Tsarist authorities at first in the Kaunas province, Gokowna Gubernia, in the end of the first half of the 19th century, in Samogitia. Then also in the provinces, in other provinces of the western region. Because of their Slavic bonds, I get back to Belarusians, they were also the most seductive element both for Poles and Russians in their political ideology to transform them into one of those modern nations. After 1918, Polish politics to Belarusians living in the east of the Second Republic, that means the Vilna region, to say it mildly, was catastrophic. It is documented by the newly published research of Józef Obremski and Seweryn Wisłoch. There was no place for any reasonable approach to Belarusian national identity, therefore they, in the majority, have chosen the Bolshevik option. Polonization processes were triggered after the January uprising of 1863, equally with the national revival of Lithuanians and Belarusians. These phenomena, from those speak about the Polonization, are still not developed in modern history research, but they have been realized and observed even by the Polish historiography and social studies before 1939. As for example in Władysław Wielchorski's works, where he points out the regress of Lithuanian language in the 19th century when this language was replaced by local dialects of Belarusian and Polish. To summarize, one must say that the social group of Polish-speaking peasantry in historic Lithuania, although maybe non-numerous and differentiated from the ethnic point of view, was still visible and in some places even predominant, as in the Vilna city surroundings at the beginning of the 20th century. So this situation hasn't changed much. Now I'm coming to the closure. Clergy. Few sentences about clergy. The Roman Catholic clergy was divided into two separate camps, at least since 1818s and 1819s, the modern Lithuanian one and the Polish one. The tragic moment was when those divisions started to be advertised and came into social notice was the beginning of the 20th century, and the Polish-Lithuanian quarrels about the language of ceremonies in the church. Roman Catholic clergy, en masse, as Michał Roman wrote, was anti-Russian in their Polish part as well as in their Lithuanian core. But the nationalist divisions, Polish versus Lithuanian, were the most transparent and visible at that moment. Conclusion. The 17th century Vilnius and Lithuania were a very tolerant town and a country where each person could live without any troubles in the multi-ethnic surroundings. It is perfectly described in the recent book of David Frick, which I show you, Kin and Neighbors, Communities and Confessions in 17th Century Vilna. There were Orthodox, there were Roman Catholics, there were Lutherans, Calvinists, as well as Russian Muscovy All-Believer, Muslim Tatar, Mosaic Jews, Karayats, and even more those denominations and ethnicities. They also represented a multi-ethnic milieu, the proto-nationals, I say about the 17th century, the proto-nationals, Poles, Proto-Poles, Proto-Lithuanians, Proto-Ruthenians, Belarusians, Germans, Saxons, French, Italians, Scots, and many others. Dutch also. What has happened with this colorful environment at the end of the 19th century and at the beginning of the 20th century, especially in the capital town of Vilnius? Frankly saying, some of those previous divisions survived. The ethnic environment have preserved many of its ancient specific traits. On the other hand, the process of language implementation also seriously accelerated. Polish language, forbidden to be used in public places by Tsarist authorities after 1863 January uprising, earned some special popularity and grounded its foundation as the most popular tool of interpersonal relation, in spite of the officially supported and glorified Russian. To say it frankly, it is very good presented in David Frick's book that Polish language started to be lingua franca in Grand Duchy of Lithuania at the end of the 17th century, and with this episode after the January uprising, when the Russian language was forced to be in use, it still existed till 1918 and the division of Lithuania after the First World War. Other languages also were still in use: Belarusian, Lithuanian, Jewish, and many others. But the Polonization was overwhelming in the whole social sphere. All those speaking Polish, local inhabitants, despite of their ethnic roots, might be defined as Old Lithuanians, but we must remember the significant part of them was simply, or choose simply, straight Polish option. And this is the word. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Zaszczep, for your interesting insights. I think we will discuss after the second speaker. Firstly, I would like to thank you for respecting the 20 minutes time limits, and I ask for the next speaker also to respect it. So if it's okay with the auditorium, I would ask to keep all your questions after the second speaker. So Professor Egidijus Aleksandravičius, Vytautas Magnus University, and his insights on this seminar. There you are, have the floor.
First, I want to excuse myself being late, and for my explanation I would say in Lithuanian, our life, mūsų gyvenimas, ypač mano, laikosi ant betvarkės. In Polish it would sound like Polska nie rządem stoi, specjalnie kiedy individual life is like that. In English it would sound my life is based on chaos. That's why I'm late. I was so sure it's 2 o'clock at the beginning of our conference. Again, I would like to start similar way Leszek Żastor did, advertising some books. Different from Leszek, he advertised not his own book, but other author book. This one is a collection of articles of Lithuanian, Polish, Italian, and a couple of other countries. It sounds in Lithuanian, Lietuva ir Lenkija 20 amžiaus geopolitinėje vaizduotėje. In English it would be Lithuania and Poland in the political imagination of the 20th century. Almost half of the materials are in English, and the copies, I imagine, extremely widespread because 100 of them published, and I have only this book, and please return it. Okay, continuing in that manner, I didn't write anything. Why? Because I could guess what Professor Leszek Żastov will tell. Why? Because when I was invited to participate in this meeting, and I am really thankful for that, I was really glad having an opportunity to meet my old friend and to be given an opportunity to continue our debate we started 30 years ago. Majority of that class were not born at that time. Yes. It's the topic we started, we returned, we continued, and I would say, I would recognize frankly, I do not have clear explanations or straight answers. But what I could say, I agree with what Leszek Żastov told about Lithuania, exposing one extremely interesting feature, that Polish historiography knows much more about Lithuania, old, bit less about new one, but Lithuanian historiography knows extremely little about Poland. And in this respect, I only would like to add one thing. When we speak about old Lithuanian identity, when we speak about some sort of transformation during 19th century Spring of Nations time to the new Lithuanian identity, it touches again Polish side too. Why? I could agree with the notions popularized by Czesław Miłosz, telling that, you know, in this side of East Central Europe, Lithuanians showed some sort of miracle, surviving when everybody was so certain it is like a vanished kingdom. Lithuanians survived, reborn in the end of the 19th century, but strangely reborn from the subject of political civilization to the product of philology. In very sharp and straight theoretical approach, it would be a difference between ethno-political identity based on civic values and rule of law and the ethno-nationalistic understanding of the nation or people only as the spiritual phenomenon. One is, first of all, nation-state in terms of more or less empire structure. A lot of multi, confession, linguistic, social, genetic, territorial, whatever. The opposite is only very narrow, very sharp, and very painful ethno-nationalistic description. It's a community speaking one language and living stable on the one side of Nemunas River. During 600 years, starting from the old Lithuanian Grand Duchy, ending with the Lithuanian Republic, those turns of identity happened. And then old Lithuanian meant definitely different things than New Lithuanian in the beginning of the 20th century, but with one very, very important thing: we still have our future. It means that problem of Lithuanian identity and development from the old complicated one to less complicated but very, very painful new was based on that during those 200 years modern nation got time to revive, rebuild and reconstruct itself. Only a couple of decades this nation got freedom, political freedom, to construct those ethno-political civic values, or reconstruct, restore those values we developed in the 14th, 16th centuries. Being occupied by the Russian Empire, long 19th century, again being occupied for 40 years by even more harsh Soviet regime, Lithuanians could survive or defend extremely in the ethno-linguistic trenches. Because it was impossible to develop some understanding, some forms of identity based on rule of law when we were occupied and the laws were Russian. And this is still very, very important problem for history of Lithuanian identity, mentality, and sometimes not only Lithuanian, but all Soviet or post-communist people. Some sort of very tricky, very chameleonic relation to the so important and symbolically important symbol of rule of law, constitution or Lithuanian state. Old Lithuanian asked who she or mostly he is, would answer, I'm Lithuanian because I love freedom and believe in Lithuanian state. If you read de Tocqueville, please compare with some bigger nations who were able to base identity on the rule of law and civil law. We got that in 17th century, and we almost forgot that during the decades of repression and occupation, living under conditions of Russian enforced laws and habits and political system, and defending only last alamo language, ethno-linguistic community, because other means of identification, religion, it was not so complicated like in Bosnia, but not less complicated because it was simple enough to recognize the frontier of Catholicism and recognize where Slavic or Russian civilization starts, but it was so difficult to recognize where are the demarcation lines between Polish and Lithuanian Catholicism, because both nations were Catholic. This is also a very, very important story. I just try to comment what Leszek just told. It was so good synthesis, and I said that only one thing I should add to this, because all the understanding of the Pole and Polishness was also not in terms of ethno-linguistic nationalism and so on. Not Lithuanian historians could decode that. But I just based my insight on Janusz Tasbyr or a bit on Juliusz Bardach works. But Janusz Tasbyr, for example, Kultura Szlachecka, noble culture, Polish noble culture, usually could repeat and prove that understanding of the Pole in the old time was not in terms of nationalism, or contemporary nationalism. The Pole was nobleman, like old Lithuanian was nobleman only. They were the citizen. They were a nation and the people. People, peasants, Jews, others, could be a lot of different groups. But nation was perceived as the ethno-political entity. And again, Poland, Kingdom of Poland, never ruled Grand Duchy of Lithuania. Even if Polish civilization, language, approached the Lithuanian life. According to one strange but extremely popular in Lithuanian narrative, poet and Catholic bishop in the end of the 19th century, very beginning of the 20th century, Antoni Baranowski or Antanas Baranauskas, was so certain telling that I do not agree with the most hot Lithuanian nationalists who started with the first Lithuanian periodical Aušra. I do not agree with them because they always blame Poles for Polonization of Lithuania, for sort of repressions in the past, and he opposed his, and I agree with him here, the version saying Poland never ran Lithuania, never fight it, never conquered, just unions, negotiations, and civilization impact was given by them and chosen by Lithuanians. We have chosen Polish language for our lingua franca. He had no time to say that, please just compare with Scottish, Irish, sometimes Finnish examples. One language, but the so hot patriotism like for a short time Irish. To blow something in London and speak nice English language with no word of Irish, yes? This is a confusion in the contemporary world, and especially Lithuania. If we compare historiographies, at this very moment I could say that there is no serious clashes or misunderstanding. We could debate using similar categories, methods, and understand each other. But the national narrative, popular notion, collective memory and collective forms of identification sometimes seem so distant from historiography. In Lithuania it is really a problem. If we go a bit distant from the topic we are discussing about Old Grand Duchy and identity of Old Grand Duchy, it's okay, but even if we would touch the topics like Holocaust in Lithuania and Lithuanian participation in Holocaust. During 20 years, Lithuanian historiography achieved extremely high level reconstructing all atrocities happened in Lithuania and with Lithuanian participation in that. But the public opinion was not affected by that. If you would research public opinion, anonymous comments in internet, we'll see, like difference from imaginated heaven or paradise and hell. Historiography means one thing, national narratives sometimes mean a bit different things. In this respect, I would say that if we compare approach achieved by the historians and the literature professionals, cultural historians, here we see more or less, like I said, I agree with what Leszek Żastov told. I agree, more or less, I would say, similar story, and if we would do that in a sort of hot nationalistic environments, I suppose that Leszek would be met by a bit of noise in some Warsaw suburban suburban place, like me in Lithuanian open or public space would be presented as the sort of Polonophiles. Like how could you explain this story? That's the problem. That's the problem. But as I am told, our debate is very old. We started in the early 80s, meeting in the dark times of commune and martial law in Poland. First, Leszek came to Vilnius doing his archival researches, and I said, okay, you are a good example of Leszekas Žostautas, more Lithuanian than Egidijus Aleksandrovich. Noble family tradition and my peasant family tradition. And 10 years or a bit more later, we met many times during that 10 years, but 10 years later we met on one archival piece and one case. The case was from mid-19th century, more or less from 1853, 1855. Documents concentrated on the case when Russian Ministry of Education, Imperial Ministry of Education, decided to try to separate Lithuanians and Poles in the secondary schools of Lithuania, or as it was called, Northwestern gubernias. 3 years. They did some sort of research, they counted, they calculated, and then we met interpreting similar document of conclusion. And what was the conclusion at that time? Leszek would not allow to lie or misinterpret this document. But first was, we can't do that. Russian administration told. Why? Because it's impossible to manage this process. It's impossible to recognize who is a real Lithuanian and who is a real Polish. Because sometimes they have got very Lithuanian or even Samogitian names like Žostautas or Remeika or some others, and they are so harsh Polish patriots. Other way, sometimes we find Polish names like Aleksandrovich or Jankowski or Jankauskas. Those names were so simple to refurbish one or another side. But they are so hot Lithuanian patriots, and we don't know what basis could be used to recognize them. And it was left for the historical process to solve. And maybe similar time when we met each other on the same archival document, I was very close to one famous Vilnius professor and maybe patriarch or old Vilnius culture, Professor Vladas Drėma, a guy from Gerviečiai, contemporary Belarusian territory, alumni of Batory University in Vilnius, and he was a historian of art and architecture here. I was young and crazy like today historian. And I visited him, even if he was not my professor. He did different work. And the main lesson I got from him was, it's too simple to try reconstruct a map of Lithuanian and the Polish identity. It's not the problem of demarcation line on the political territories. Problem is that the demarcation line came through one individual. And then you are left to solve those problems in the future. My time is over. Excuse me for this bohemic approach, but it's because Leszek was so correct.
Thank you, Professor Alexandrovich, for this always bohemic approach, but also which gave us a lot of insights. And I think that our seminar is also about something not to be afraid and to talk openly and honestly. Some hard points of our common history, for instance, Vilnius annexation or 38 ultimatum, or I don't know, Panerei, which is very, very close to Vilnius. So I think if we, of course, this is not the issue of probably of this seminar, but our idea was to be afraid enough and not to be in order not to be afraid to touch all these things, in order to let them to be revealed and to be healed. So let us start our discussion time. If you have any questions or any remarks, please raise your hand and please present yourself.
Yeah, I'm the student of this university. I have a question.
And could you please present yourself?
That is from the Department of History. And my question would be, like for the professors, what is your opinion? How free was each person to choose its identity, or how it was reconstructed for him by the family, by the or by whatever else? Especially in the mid-19th century, when it was still in the question, as you told, like every person was going through his own discussions, probably, or something like that.
I would start only to advertise Leszek, because he could remember from his family stories, not me. My family stories were very simple. Both grandparents were captured captured by Polish troops during the fights. spent some months in the concentration camps. One escaped and told later different stories with some fun, joy and humor. Another one was probably humiliated and he was traumatized and hated so much. But no so big atrocities like it could happen with Bolshevik prisoners at that time. But I'm just saying that I can explain that only as the historian who did the research on the other lives. When Leszek probably could tell his mother's story or something like that. It was not easy, those recognitions. If we look at, for example, to famous Samogitian gentry families like Narutavici. One, Stanislav Narutovich, was the activist of Lithuanian national revival, one of the organizers of Vilnius Seimas in the year 1905, and later became the, one of the teams of those activists who signed Lithuanian Declaration of Independence. His brother Gabriel Narutovich was the first elected president of Poland, killed right a week later because he was the fan of a federalist idea. No. One family, two ways. Okay, let's go further to families like Biržiško's family. Three professors, famous, classical public activists like Michał Biržiško or Mykolas Biržiška, Václav Biržiško or Václavas Biržiška. In the year 1897, all three signed in the Russian imperial census. One as the Pole, second as Lithuanian, third one as Samogitian. Then later they cooperated. I spent quite a lot of time with the famous historian. When I spent this time, she was very old, from Daugirduf, Daugirdaitės Rogienė, Vanda Daugirdaitės Rogienė. And she told a lot about those difficulties for the local Lithuanian gentry, young guys to choose them. Because nationalism just pressed this traditional identity when they could be two in one. Or even three in one. It was possible to feel Lithuanian and Pole. And okay, I am Polish or I am Lithuanian, but until the moment we are together with Poland. If we separate, then my identity would be crashed. But what Vanda Daugirduvna Srogienė told them, the crucial point was first World War and the fights and legions, Haller Legion, when guys from Samogitian villages, from Virvyti or other place, the most Lithuanian place of historical Lithuania, when they came to Haller Legions, fight it, and then they returned back, they were Polish. It was enforced crossroad to choose one or another. And please, in this respect, remember a dialogue of Tomas Venclova and Czesław Miłosz in Kultura, later published in Gazeta Wyborcza, that when he remembers the early 30s, and he was from a Polish-Lithuanian family, both identities in one. And that's it. Young Lithuanian nationalists hated to meet somebody like that. They preferred to meet anima naturaliter endaciana, because in this respect the enemy was so clear. And I suppose that they suffered that very straight, but we will still feel that long enough in different groups of our society. And
this question is still the same, that it's easier for the Lithuanians to speak with Poles from Warsaw as me, no? than to speak with Poles from Vilnius, from Vilnius surroundings. But one thing I think should be stressed here, that we have probably we have changed the definition or the understanding of the notion of what was Polish till 1795 and what was Polish after that moment. because in my opinion, this is not my idea, this idea also of my uncle Wiktor Sukiennicki from Kaunas, that we, let's say, started to use the name Poland in its contemporary sense as a national, as an element of the nationality, Polish nationality. But if we look at the time of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, Poland was used very often as a citizenship. So that's might be equal to or equalized to the republic or the state. So there was a text of Wiktor Sukiennicki. It was the results of the certain semantic mistake that was starting to using Poland in this contemporary nationalistic way, and not as it was before. What concerns those changes and the choosing of the nationality, it's difficult to explain, because in each part of the society strata there were different stories. In the peasantry we could have situations that someone was pressed to choose nationality, and of course that's what I said in my text today, that when I was let's say inhabiting the Republic of Lithuania after 1918, if I was a peasant and I was, for example, a peasant who considered himself to be a Pole, I would be pressed to be a Lithuanian peasant, and the government and the authorities, the administration, the bureaucracy in Lithuania tell me, Zasztoft, you are Tautas, you are Lithuanian, no discussion, finito. And I must be Lithuanian. But before this First World War, very often situations were similar with the Russian authorities, because they came here and was Alexandrovich or Zasztotas, and they pressed, okay, you're Belarusian, you are Russian. If I was an Orthodox, for example, I was pressed to be treated as a Russian, to choose the Russian nationality, and the consequences were that I was, let's say, put in the jail of this nationality, of the Russian nationality, although at home I could speak Lithuanian or Polish, no one cared about it. And I probably were such a situation earlier, but the problem is that there is no sources to make such a study, for example, concerning 17th century. We know that there were divisions in the denominations, Christian denominations, so there were Lutherans or Calvinists and Roman Catholics. Probably there were some consequences of this, that some of them were let's say, pro-German or something like that, but we don't pro-Swedish in Lithuania during the Swedish invasion. But of course there were no later consequences of this situation. And what with those the most people on the top, with this elite intellectuals, that's a very good example of Mykolas Almeris, that he till 1918 he was considered himself as a Pole. He was a member of Legiony, Piłsudski's Legiony, and then after the taking Wilno by General Żeligowski, he changed his mind. He said that he could not stand it, and he moved down to Kaunas. So that was the moment he said in practice that I'm Lithuanian, I do not agree with such a Polish policy. So that was the biography of Ramirez is divided in two parts, let's say, in my opinion. So some of those people who were thinking more deeply and trying to understand those labyrinths or puzzles of identity, of nation, roots, national roots, they've been very often on very poor people, because they couldn't find themselves. They do not feel themselves comfortable in Polish circles, but they later do not feel comfortable in the Lithuanian one too. So, and look, there were also the Jewish people, for example, who started to be defining themselves as Poles, for example, or Russians. And then after
Lithuanians,
Lithuanians, after 1918, they had to, for example, change or choose nationality from Russian to Lithuanian, or from Polish to Lithuanian, or from Russian to Polish, and that we know such cases. That so there were also the nationality or ethnic groups which were even less or more degraded and more in the more not, let's say, not comfortable situation than Lithuanians.
If I may add, excuse me, because I said that we just continue what was and not so simple to make it shorter. But if I would repeat some words of Michal Romer in the year 1915, when he was conscious member of Haller legions and probably behaved like an expert or even an agent of legions in Lithuania. But he wrote in his report to the staff of Legion saying, don't do those damn mistakes making identification of what's Lithuanian and what's Polish according to the social strata. Because the narrative of the Polish side was mostly based that all noblemen are Polish. Lithuanian nationalists who invited those noblemen returned back to the body of true Lithuanians. And if they refused, then they also were left behind the identification line. But Romer wrote, it's a mistake, because we got a lot of peasants in Lithuania who are Polish-speaking, and we got a lot of gentry who were Lithuanian patriots. And in the generation of Lithuanian national revival, if we count 200 of most active people in the end of the 19th century, almost 1/3 of them were noblemen. And sometimes if we want to look even more attractive examples to make our question even more complex, I would say about Count Tadas Puzina or Tadeusz Puzina, who was a volunteer of Lithuanian army and got a Cross of Vytis for his courageous acts, but mostly fighting with some other volunteers of noble descent against the Bolsheviks. I never heard about using those troops against the Polish side. But if you want to look for those examples when noblemen joined Lithuanian national project, and even aristocrats did that, Romer is like the most colorful example because he left unique diaries. Unique diaries which are now transcription is the awful work at all. Leszek knows that. But now we already got at least 5 volumes, 5 thick volumes of Romer diaries.
In Lithuanian?
In Lithuanian. We still wait publication in Polish. Because
one volume in Polish published by Solak.
Oh. But he wrote his diaries 40 years. You should imagine an epoch in the most intellectual individual. And there are sources, but those sources are very complex and they change a bit of the academical attitude. Here we understand that not the facts themselves, but some sort of interpretation and ability of empathy to understand other choice, other family, and so on. And we still need that empathy so much.
Okay, thank you. Could I collect some questions, and then in order to be shorter, and then I should ask also our speakers to be a bit shorter. So please, you and then Thomas. Here you are. Yes, please.
My name is Ludmila. I was born in Vilnius. Gerbiamas Professor Alexandravicius paid much attention to what he agreed to. Gerbiamas Professor, Pani Professorze Leszek I would like to ask about the things you disagree, because it would help us to prevent possible ethnic conflicts that would give some intrigue to our discussion.
Okay, thank you, Ludmila.
I just want a very short question regarding the concept of federation of the father of the Polish state, Józef Piłsudski. His idea was to create a Central European Federation, a kind of a statehood, which we thought was the only possibility for any statehood in this region to survive between Germany and Russia. And the history proved that he was quite correct with this thesis. And what we are actually doing now, we are building up his federation with Germany. So there's a progress. And so what would be interesting for me at that time? Were there any conditions? Was there any chance that this idea, this great statesman had? He was from Lithuania, therefore. To become reality. Would a Lithuanian society, Belarusian society of people living here accept this federation? Was there any chance to make it real? Or it was just an illusion? Yeah.
And Professor Mitya, the third one.
Actually, what you showed was wonderful, because you showed something that explodes the traditional nationalistic idea, and that is idea of fixed, exclusive identity, and shows that identities most often were actually inclusive and were transiting from one to another, even within an individual's life. And this is the concept that actually needs to be readdressed, and that has, to a large extent, been forgotten through nationalistic discourses that were mentioned. And that is why it might be so important that some of those insights, particularly those diaries, would also be made public, not only to Polish and Lithuanian readers, but hopefully to some English and some other languages as well, so that we can get the insight.
May I ask to be short in 15 minutes at least, because otherwise we will not get our coffee, and we have our fundamental rights. Coffee break.
Maybe I start, because I'm not so as eloquent as Professor Alexander, which will be shorter. What depends about the differences? Everything is different in the approach, in the Polish and Lithuanian approach. We are exceptions. And let's say it this way, maybe not in Poland it's not as visible as here, but you have here in the, let's say, in the milieu of the Lithuanian historians, there are, let's say, liberals and hardliners, let's say it like this. And Professor
You are very decent.
okay. Professor Alexandrovich represents this tradition of liberal historians, but of course on the other side there is much more crowdy hardliners. And everything what I said, for example, tonight, wouldn't be accepted by such a straight Lithuanian approach, because that's what you have said, that in the traditional nationalistic vision, there was no the drop of Polish blood, the drop of Lithuanian, Tatar, nothing. It might be only pure Lithuanian, pure Polish, pure Russian, pure Jewish person, and that's it. There's no possibility of mixture. What, of course, from the point of view of the history of Grand Duchy of Lithuania, is absolutely stupid, because this country was a mixture, always was a mixture. So the differences are very significant, and also on the Polish side, because there are the historians mostly who are concentrated, focused on the history of the modern times, till the end of the First Republic, till 1795, who stand on the position that the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, in spite of the separate treasure, separate army, separate law, and separate elite, aristocratic elite, still it was the same as the crown. This was also a kind of Poland, you know. So there are also such historians in Polish circles. So maybe not so numerous, but still there. What concerned the federation, federation was impossible during the Piłsudski time, because neither Lithuanians nor Belarusians wanted to have any federation with Poland, because Poland was too dangerous for most countries, because those processes of Polonization were to be prolonged and strengthened. So to choose Poland as a kind of friend and brother in such a federation, that was like taking the gun and shooting your head. So we must say it frankly. Of course, from Polish point of view, and especially from Narodowa Demokracja view, that would be great because Belarusians were, they thought, very easy to Polonize. Lithuanians are not so numerous, so maybe we can manage. So all those people started with Poles. No? This is a great idea. You know, let's make a lot of Poles in the Eastern Europe. So the federation was impossible. It was impossible. That was suicide for Lithuanians, suicide for Belarusians. Well, that's my point of view.
Maybe I was not successful making my jokes in the very beginning of my paper, because my disagreement with Leszek Żastov was pointed out when I said that Polish concept was also changed during history. But in his paper he used to do one example from Lithuanian, that Lithuanians just changed identity and they are not conscious enough to understand that. But in my understanding, similar, maybe not so 100% like in case of Lithuanian, this change from political civilization to the productive philology happened. In Polish side, probably it was 45%. I hope you understand here my statistical jokes. Less expressed. But it changed again. And especially what I feel, more contemporary time, more changes. In the year 1918, probably Polish side somehow conservated this old understanding. But after Second World War, after this communist nationalism, when even the Grabski's projects were exploited by Stalinist, the new construction of Poland with Ziemia Odzyskane in the West, it changed. Poles became much more nationalistic.
We had to create the idea of Western, let's say, revived territories, because if we do not find such idea, there was no excuse why we take this Niederschlesien, Posen province, Pommern, old Slavic territories, you know.
But this story, what was presented by Leszek today, if I would translate that in decent way in Lithuanian, I could say yes, exactly, except that in a couple of cases I would use Lithuanian instead of Polish, because the individualities were so complex, and if they are double identity, which one you choose? Usually, as I joke about Alexandrovich and Žostautas.
Imagine what's the problem when you are of the Tatar descent.
Yeah, some of my colleagues proved that I got a bit of blood of Lithuanian Tatars. That's why I'm so happy. Second, I know if you need more explanation, I'm not given enough of time to explain how deeply we are in some sort of disagreements with Leszek. And it doesn't mean that I am just playing a fan of his personal performance. If I would start this, I wonder how Leszek would react to my point.
I would like to add one thing that maybe should be stressed, that one thing happened in Polish historiography thanks to the liberal Lithuanian historians. They are translated in Polish language, and for example, one of the books of Aleksandrovichus and Kułakauskas was translated in Krakow into Polish, and it's very popular. So the result of this is that the stance and the Lithuanian approach to the history of not only of Grand Duchy of Lithuania but of the whole Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth has changed. And now it's impossible to find in Poland the serious historian who do not know this Lithuanian approach and do not try to discuss this Lithuanian approach, because if he don't do it, that's always he's condemned as an unprofessional figure. So this is very important. So Egidius is very popular in Poland.
Thank you. Thank you. Question about Lithuanian federalism was explained in the vanished book I just It was my article about Lithuanian federalism.
And I put a question in this article, why we are so used to read federalism Polski, but never, but never we use Lithuanian federalism. My explanation was because so long we were occupied by the Soviets, and we were exploited by this simulacre of a federal state, repressed, occupied, and if Lithuanians would develop some sort of positive sense of federalism, we would just put some or pour some water on the mill of Soviet propaganda. Going deeper, in the beginning of the 20th century, Lithuanian side of Krajovci would accept federalism. Lithuanian Social Democrats also put federalistic approach to the program. But it was not so popular because some sort of backup of that topic was very, very negatively developed story of Lithuanian Union. Because Union would be just repeated by modern federalists. And the third was some political realism, because Lithuanians felt so weak against 10 or 15 times bigger Polish political body, and they understood that in some respect there could be sort of asymmetric federation. So asymmetric that we just play some decent talks, but reality would be Polish cultural well-being, economy and political load and so on. And Lithuanians were so keen to speak about more wide federation. European Union instead of Pilsudskian imagination. But we should add to this that Pilsudskian imagination was also not accepted by the majority of nationalistic minded Poles.
Because Poles thought that if this federation will be realized, then we will have a lot of Ruthenians, Belarusians, Orthodox people in our Roman Catholic country, and that would be the big problem. Because if there are crowds of Belarusians, you cannot colonize them. So that from the Swiss nationalistic point of view, that was not good to make any federation with anyone.
And your question was about English explanation and more readings on that topic. I don't know about many of our Lithuanian plans, but what I can promise a book of my English articles, one collection for next year.
But we know that during the First World War, in the Social Democratic Lithuanian circles and also in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, when the Republic was created, there were the people who thought seriously about the kind of federation, but that never had a chance for realization.
They discussed, even in the beginning of the 20th century, about any opportunity to develop political structure similar to Finnish and Swedish and Finland. Imagine this example with the miracles of national solidarity, miracles of the Winter War in the 40s, fighting back Soviets with so hot patriotism, having Swedish Mannerheim as the national hero who spoke very, very weak Finnish, even to claim patriotic manifestos in the time of war. Or another example, which was also discussed in the beginning of the 20th century by Lithuanian intellectuals, was example of Belgium. We know about Belgium now, probably it would be...
Big troubles.
It's going great.
Okay. Thank you very much for the questions and answers. I think we should stop right now for the coffee break, and I'm sorry to forgot to introduce our vice minister, and probably after the coffee break we will ask you to if you wish, of course, if you wish. So after the coffee break, I will give my the chair rules to my friend Dr. Tomasz Milek. So everybody is welcome to the cafeteria for the talk.
So I would like to welcome you to our second session of our seminar. First of all, I would like to introduce myself. My name is Tomasz Mirej. I'm a researcher at the Institute for Eastern European Law at the University of Cologne in Germany. And perhaps you are wondering what a Polish guy working in Germany, speaking in English, is doing in Vilnius. It's European Union, baby. It's my friendship with my daughters that I'm very thankful to you for organizing this seminar. We exchanged 100 emails about it. I was wondering how he can do that, but he did it, so a big applause for him. I would like also to mention that it is a very big honor for me to chair a session at the University of Vilnius. Let's say I would like to continuing to say a couple of things about our topic, and I have read ECMI, European Center for Minority Issues, working paper which was issued in September this year. It is a very interesting paper, and one of the core conclusions of it is that in Lithuania there are shortcomings as regards bringing into line the Lithuanian legislation with the Framework Convention of Minority Rights. Basically, these shortcomings are in the area of linguistic rights, spelling names in passports, street names, and using languages, minority languages, in the official, in the government sphere, in the official sphere. And there are, the person who has written, it was obviously a lawyer, claims that initiatives aiming at bringing about changes to legislation, to bring it into line with international standard, that there was emotional opposition by the government officials, emotional opposition. And also, I suppose that these initiatives were also voiced, not quite without any emotion, but it's not mentioned here. But I can imagine that. And there are basically three ways of dealing with this problem. First is to treat every issue separately. So we could organize a stage panel on spelling names in passports. First panel, and a second panel on street bilingual street names. And perhaps we are even going to do such panels, but not today. Because the newspapers are basically full of these problems. The second way of dealing with this problem, to bring in the line of legislation, is to go to the grassroots of the problem. And this is what we were trying to do today in our previous session. To look why we get emotional about spelling names. I live in Germany. My name is misspelled permanently, and I don't get emotional for some reason. Well, my name is shown. I don't get it. And the third way, and this is what we are going to do now, is dealing with emotions. What are the consequences of being emotional? What is the impact of these being emotional on politics and on our lives, ultimately? And this is what our panel is about. And therefore, we invited two outstanding experts. I will make just a short introduction of you. But if you read anything, any scientific paper on government, on comparative government, on Europe, on regionalism, on ethnopolitics, you will very soon come across the names of these two gentlemen. Our first speaker is Dr. Peter van Houten. Dr. Peter van Houten graduated from the University of Amsterdam, and he also holds an MA and PhD degree from the University of Chicago. And now he teaches at the University of Cambridge. As you know, in the United Kingdom there are 2 universities which are not that bad. The University of Cambridge and the other. Our second speaker is Professor Mitja Žagar. Professor Mitja Žagar I just printed the CV of Professor Žagar. It's from 2008. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pages. And it's 6 years also, now perhaps 10 or even more. Professor Žagar is a lawyer, but he's a professor at the Faculty of Social Science at the University of Ljubljana. He's also a researcher in the Institute of Ethnic Studies in Ljubljana, which has a very good reputation, and we hope for the institute to survive and to continue its work. So that was a short introduction, and now I would like to say, so being just a part of this impressive lineup, I cannot even pretend to be an expert. Anyway, your comment on fixed and exclusive identity still makes me feel like sharing with you a certain myth, a personal myth in which I deeply believe. And this is a myth, it's a commonwealth of Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which existed until the end of the 18th century. And this Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was not about fixed and exclusive identity, but it was an idea. It was a certain idea. It was an idea of freedom, of a golden freedom, as the novelty at the time used to say. And it was shared. It was an idea which was shared by many peoples and many religions. This state, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, it had one of the oldest democracies, even if it was limited to nobility. It had one of the oldest parliaments. It didn't witness religious wars. There was a strong commitment to tolerance and to mutual respect. And it was a state in which absolutism and oppression was always opposed. And because it was also a state which collapsed, because, as I would say, it was also ahead of its time. And if you look at today's Polish and Lithuania, I will have to recognize that after the rise of nationalism, the ethnic identity became very important. But even though we should also, Polish and Lithuanians and Belarusians and Ukrainians, be aware of our common heritage, of our common good, we must not allow to reduce our identity to Poland, to Lithuania, to Vilnius, to reduce us to the ethnic affiliation only, and to abuse it for political purposes. We are in responsibility to preserve our common heritage and our common traditions, which is a unique tradition of non-exclusive identity. And having said that, I would like to hand over to give a floor to our first speaker, Dr. Van Houten, please.
Thank you very much, Thomas, for that rather generous introduction, which on one hand is great, on the other hand I inevitably won't be able to live up to that. But I'll do my best. I'm also not really talking about emotions, but we'll see, although in a way I guess you are. So, and another apology is that I don't have a book to send around, so hopefully you'll forgive me for that. Next time. So yeah, thanks for inviting me to this panel seminar. I'm very pleased to be here. It's my first time in Lithuania, and that's to some extent relevant because my first point is that I'm not an expert on Lithuania or Poland or the relations between them or ethnic relations in these states. So I won't so much talk about that, so you're going to get a broader perspective, and the aim is really to give you some sense of what how political scientists have thought about ethnic relations, and that's a big topic, so there's only a few bits and pieces of that, but particularly focusing on the political mobilization of ethnicity or ethnic identity, which I think is a slightly more neutral term than the exploitation that's in the title of my talk. So let's call it mobilization. And I want to indicate some questions and arguments that have come out of fairly recent political science research on the issues, and hopefully this is interesting to you lawyers mostly here. Now I think probably when people think about ethnic relations, ethnic conflict, particularly non-experts, probably would first think about conflicts, about civil wars, about tensions, about problems. And we do indeed regularly see that in the media. I mean, problems and conflicts always are more likely to make the media than things that are going well and peacefully. But so we can think of terrible cases such as Rwanda in Africa, maybe Syria now, where there is actually quite an important ethnic dimension to the conflict that's going on there. Or a bit more closer to home, so to speak, or closer to here. The war in Yugoslavia in the early 90s, the first half of the 1990s, the conflict in the Caucasus, the various conflicts in the Caucasus, in fact. So that is of course also what got a lot of political scientists interested in these issues, but the research quickly shows, and I'm sure historians would fully agree with that these conflicts, although the ones that I mentioned are real and are very tragic, are only one aspect of the way ethnic relations and ethnic politics plays out. And I want to give you some sense of this in this presentation, and do this through a discussion of what seem to me to be fairly common perceptions, not necessarily by the experts, but by out there about ethnic politics and the consequence of ethnic politics, and show that these are, at least in part, based on misconceptions, and that the picture is a lot more nuanced and complicated. And I will do that by saying something. The three issues I want to say something about are basically the formation of ethnic parties, so-called ethnic parties that appeal to a specific ethnic group, usually a minority group, but you could in principle also have one that obviously tries to mobilize a larger minority, and how they try to get their support. The second issue has to do with the relation between ethnic mobilization and the stability of democracies, which has been a big concern, that once you get ethnic mobilization, this might destabilize particularly fairly new democratic states, and look a bit at the role of external actors, particularly in what the political science literature referred to as kin states. This is K-I-N, which are homelands, which is basically states that have a minority across the border, so it would be indeed Poland and the Polish minority, or Russia, and what that effect might be of having a state that's a possible interest in that on ethnic relations. So, but to start, I think the first thing to say is that certainly from most perspectives, certainly from a political science perspective, that it isn't really very surprising that ethnic identities sometimes become politically mobilized. I think political scientists think about it, it is one of the possible identities, and even ethnic identity, as we already heard earlier, are not fixed by any means, so there is fluidity there. But if you look more broadly in terms of what becomes the basis on which people politically identify with particular programs or parties, you can also think of class identities, other identities, and ethnic identity is one aspect of that, and it can become politically salient, particularly if certain interests are tied to these identities, or more importantly, if it's possible to frame the situation in such a way that it seems like particular interests are tied to a particular ethnic identity. And it can of course be most directly be language rights, minority rights that Thomas was mentioned, but also things like economic well-being. For example, if there's a perception that there is socioeconomic discrimination of some kind against certain groups, or if you have a territory, a part of a country where it's mostly populated by one ethnic group, and they feel that somehow its economy is being held back, being constrained by state policies, and to give you some, and you can certainly see some of these scenarios playing out in Western Europe, which is the area that I've looked mostly at in my research, where you have things like socioeconomic discrimination played a role in the conflict in Northern Ireland, for example, and was an important dimension of that. In Scotland, another one in the country that I'm not from, but where I do live, in the UK, in the 1970s they discovered oil in the North Sea, and that gave quite a boost to Scottish nationalism, which is very much on the agenda now. As you may know, I'm happy to talk about it in question and answer if you want. And economic issues are also important in Spain, with Catalonia and Basque Country, and the economic crisis now is one of the reasons that this is becoming more prominent again. And you do indeed see political mobilizations of ethnic identity in many countries. I mean, in Eastern Europe, ones that have been studied quite widely are Hungarian minorities, for example, in various countries, but there are also Russian minorities, of course, the Polish minority here. You have the Turkish minority in Bulgaria that also has seen some political mobilization. But the other point about that is that there's nothing inevitable about the mobilization of ethnic identities, and indeed many ethnic groups or possible ethnic groups, possible ethnic identities don't become mobilized at all. And it is of course an interesting question what explains why it is that this sometimes happens and sometimes not. This is not so much the focus of my presentation, but you can think of course about, I mean, cultural differences that can be mobilized, or that can be framed, like different languages. You can refer to as kind of the raw material that politicians and parties can build a certain political platform on is important, as are, as I said, economic issues, as are more down-to-earth issues as political leadership and political organization and how effective that can be. And indeed also institutional arrangements in a country like federal type systems, other institutional design issues also play a role in trying to get some sense of why it is that certain identities become identified. But as I say, this is not the primary focus. Instead, I want to say a few words more about basically situations where there is political mobilization of ethnic identities, and particularly in the context of democratic political systems, just to narrow it down slightly, it's broad enough as it is, this talk. And as I say, I want to discuss three what I think are fairly common general perceptions about the nature and implications of ethnic mobilization, or the mobilization of ethnic identities. And the first is basically, I think, a perception is that when you have ethnic minorities that become politically mobilized, you get so-called ethnic parties that only appeal to their own group. And indeed, you then get segments of the population that will only support, only vote for parties that are somehow representing their own ethnic group. And there are certainly examples of that. Now, I don't know enough about the Polish party here in Lithuania, whether that's the case or not. The raw percentages suggest that it might be the case, but you see it also with some parties in Basque Country and Catalonia, for example. And indeed, there are arguments that particularly in newer democracies, voting for an ethnic party make actually some sense, because other kinds of parties and interests are not so clearly defined yet. Party systems haven't been consolidated yet, and so people are looking for shortcuts, as someone talks about, seeing which party might actually be close to their interest, and kind of ethnic labels may actually be helpful in that. But it is also true that this perception isn't right. I mean, if you look more broadly at, you see parties that only manage to get the vote of a small percentage of their so-called, you can call it a target group, because a lot of these people might actually vote for non-ethnic parties, broader parties, other political parties. And more importantly for the discussion here is that some parties try to appeal to other voters, so they may on the surface seem to be an ethnic party, but try to appeal much more broadly. And this is actually true for parties like the Scottish National Party in a way, the Turkish party in Bulgaria, Hungarian parties in Serbia and Romania have been pointed out that they actually trying to expand their support base by, and that of course has implications for the kind of strategies they use and appeals they make. So this political mobilization varies, and a very important part of why it varies, and this would be obvious, but it's actually a bit harder to generalize about, is that these are political parties, so they engage in political competition, in party competition, so they have to react to what other parties are doing. In a lot of these cases, and again, some of the cases in Western Europe, like in Spain, are good examples. You get more than one party that tries to represent, to appeal to their own group, so they have to compete with each other. They also have to compete with quote-unquote national parties that are also trying to mobilize it. So it's a complicated political dynamic, but the consequence of that is that it isn't often that it is, you get appeals and strategies that are much more complicated than simply appeal and vote for me because I represent your Polish interest or your Scottish interest. And there is plenty of work in political science that has shown this. So that's point one. The second one is basically a perception that if you get ethnic mobilization, and ethnicity, if you want, becomes an important factor in politics and is an important dividing line between different parties, that this is something that may threaten, is a problem for democracies and for democratic stability. And there are of course examples of this. I mean, in a way, part of the dynamic in Yugoslavia can be a little bit described as that. Once you got regime change, system change going on, you get kind of a spiral of ethnic demands, if you want. There was a lot more going on, but on the surface of it you can read the situation a bit like that there. The same in Georgia, for example, and various African countries. Northern Ireland would be another and perhaps Belgium as well, which was mentioned briefly. Either way, you can see a language line that became institutionalized in the political system, and despite the population not caring all that much anymore about these issues, Belgium is actually in danger of splitting up as a result of the political dynamic that this has in a way unleashed. And one argument is indeed that once you get mobilization of ethnic identities, that it will lead to what the literature calls a process of outbidding, in the sense that you're going to get more and more, even if initially a party says, well, we would like some more rights, but we were happy with the rest, and another party might come up and say, well, this is not enough, you need to ask more. And if it is indeed true that parties mostly compete among the same group of voters from their own ethnic group, you might get a process by which the demands become kind of more and more radical. And that would then explain some of these examples that I mentioned. But there is other research and other studies that clearly show that this is not necessarily the case. As I already said, these parties and groups can pursue different strategies, and in the process of this they can actually become more moderate rather than more radical in their demands. And I'll give you one example. I should have brought her book, I could show around. A friend of mine who's actually at another university, not one of the two that Thomas was referring with, at University College London, Charles Stroschein, recently published a book that argues that the mobilization by Hungarian minorities in Romania and Slovakia actually, and what she talks about is not just through parties, but also through mass protests and various other ways, actually helped the consolidation of democracy in these states because it led to some concessions that moderated the demands of the majority, and interestingly enough it also moderated the demand or the positions of other parties, because they realized that there was no point of pushing further because it might just create too much problems. Over time you get a process, and she calls it actually a process of almost an implicit deliberative process, where over time you get, because of the engagement with these issues, people realize what in a way the common ground is on which they can build their state, which is not the usual perception you get about ethnic politics, but there's an enormous load of empirical information in the book, and it looks fairly plausible. And I would even argue, but this might be more for the discussion, that this mobilization you see in Scotland or even Catalonia and demands for independence, and in and of itself isn't undermining democratic stability in these countries, but that might be something that I'm happy to elaborate on later. So you get again a mixed picture, and basically that is not to say that political scientists would deny that it sometimes can spiral into conflict, but their argument usually is it's not because of the mobilization of ethnicity as such, it's because other factors contribute to that situation. Now the third point I want to make what had to do with these external actors or these kin states, where the perception is that once they get involved, or even just their presence looming over ethnic relations in a country, will make things more difficult, increases tensions. And sorry, with apologies to the Germans in the room, probably the most notorious example usually pointed out to that was the policy in the 1930s towards Sudeten Germans and various other German minorities across that became kind of an excuse, if you want, or an instrument to expand. Now this is an extreme example, but you could say something similar potentially about the role that Serbia played in the early 1990s. Hungary is regularly at least accused of trying to intervene in the affairs of various neighbor countries on behalf of their minority, of the Hungarian minorities in these countries. And this is not so much an ethnic kin state, but what Russia has been doing in Georgia with South Ossetia and such is also an example of where they can get involved and can not so much create perhaps, but certainly create or exacerbate the issues. But again, the story is more complicated if you look at it more closely. In an article that I wrote longer than I care to remember, to be honest, I argued that in certain cases these kin states can actually improve ethnic relations, because if there is a possibility that they might become involved, but they don't actually interfere too much, it might actually help to stabilize ethnic relations and to have states make compromises to their minorities, because they might anticipate that if they don't do so, then this might create problems, and that in the longer term is not necessarily a bad thing. And actually some of the examples I used were actually the role that Russia in the 90s played with Russian minorities in Estonia and Ukraine, Crimea and such, but again, I'm happy to defend that. And to my pleasing surprise, a recent article in a political science journal that did a very broad statistical study actually supported that argument and found that the role of kin states, particularly if they're very big and strong, actually don't necessarily increase conflict. And the point to take away is that that the intentions and actions of these kind of states, these homelands or kin states, can vary. They may of course use the situation of their minorities abroad for domestic political purposes, which is quite often going on. But the question you also have to ask is, do they really ultimately want to get involved in something that can get messy abroad, and can they afford to do that? So their situation is complicated as well. So to conclude, I've tried to give you some sense of some of the issues that political scientists have looked at and are looking at in relation to this political mobilization of identities, and some of the arguments they put forward. Essentially, this gives a more nuanced picture, I think, of the nature and effects of this kind of mobilization. The big question, of course, is the follow-up question, just to anticipate that, is under what conditions do you get certain kinds of outcomes? I mean, why is it that you get sometimes something leading to conflict, sometimes don't? And this is very much, I think, certainly in my field, but also beyond political science, where research on ethnic relations is very much focused on and trying to grapple with, and much more is to be done. I did give a few suggestions in passing. For example, the responses of states towards their minorities matter. Party competition and how that plays out is a factor that you should look at. And you should indeed look at institutional arrangements and institutional designs and how that might affect, and I hope that that's a natural transition to the next speaker, and some of the ways in which practices that can be done to ameliorate any, or to try to push it towards the less conflictual outcomes. So I'll leave it at that, and I'll look forward to any questions and discussion.
Thank you very much, Peter, for giving us valuable insights into the processes of ethno-mobilization. And now I'd like to give the floor to Professor Mitja Žagar, and we will have a discussion after his presentation. So, Mitja, the floor is yours. I would be thankful if you could stick to the time limits, but we are in the Central and Eastern Europe, so relax.
Actually, if I'm to follow the schedule, I'm supposed to end in 3 minutes. I'm not so sure I can do that, but I'll try my best not to too long. Actually, I will use what I prepared before as a kind of a basis, but I'd rather respond to a few issues that have already been raised, because I think that will make the discussion and also the whole enterprise more valuable and more practical, and hopefully also more interesting to a public. I would also like to point out that I'm not an expert on Polish-Lithuanian relationship, and particularly not on the development of ethnicities and identities in this part of the world. However, I did study Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth at a certain point. Namely, I did my PhD in contemporary federalism, and one of historic cases I was studying was, of course, also this specific case. And then we did a study on it again later on with Professor Wojciech Masny. So I'm aware of these historic traditions, and being aware of the historic traditions, I would probably be slightly less idealistic than you were describing them, particularly being aware of the problems that existed, of the dominance that existed, and I would say, particularly from the perspective of human rights, that's also quite important here, on the divisions and exclusions that existed within the Commonwealth. However, what was a positive tradition, I would really very much like to build upon, and it wasn't exclusive to this area of Europe, but also to some other parts of Europe, is actually the tradition of coexistence, the tradition of respect, and the tradition of cooperation. And what I would also like to add here is the tradition of actually making the borders among different groups, be them ethnic, be them religious, be them class structures, porous. Namely, there was always a way to pass from one to another, which today, particularly from this exclusivist, reductionist perception of nationalistic discourse on ethnicity, we frequently forget. And what is quite interesting is this did not only apply to ethnicity, which somehow one understands, it also applied to religion. And religion usually is probably the issue that we are not willing to negotiate much. We are not willing to negotiate on ethnicity much, but then ethnicity is also politics. When we speak of religion, we don't think that much of politics. However, again, religion also is politics. Sorry to disappoint you on that. I would like to start by stating that diversities and asymmetries actually exist in all dimensions of human life. They're actually normal phenomena and state of affairs. The perception that our societies are homogeneous, unified, unison, are actually completely against the reality that we see daily. The second point that I would like to make, and this is also a kind of internal dialogue with the proposed title of my presentation, is that diversities and pluralities are the basis for different interests. And diverse interests are also possible sources of conflicts. And as a consequence, actually conflicts and crises are normal phenomena in our societies, our normal state of affairs. What actually is a problem is how we do understand and handle them. When we are speaking of ethnicity, we have to be aware of the fact that ethnicity is just a single dimension of diversities. Class, gender, whichever socially relevant characteristic you might think of can be actually used to explore how diverse our societies are. However, what is so specific with ethnicity is that ethnic identity seems to be one of the strongest collective identities that have evolved through history. In a way, how we establish ourselves as persons, as individuals, and how we do establish ourselves as collective individual entities is we compare ourselves with the others. Basically through two processes that are going on. Processes of assimilation. I want to be like the others are, that I'm taking as my role model, or dissimulation, trying to be different from them. I mean, just think of a child. Through an early development, it would be initially assimilation, and then comes the point when dissimulation actually becomes more important. And if one takes this analogy, societies are not all that much different from an individual. However, we should be aware that in societies, we should actually combine the two dimensions. One is individual dimension, and the other is communal dimension. Collective entities. And they are not mutually exclusive. Right to the contrary. In order to create the perception of relatively social safety, security that we all need, we actually need to find the best way to combine them. I would also like to say that traditionally, when we consider collective identities, we usually see them as exclusive. We usually, in a way, draw the lines of borders that divide us from the others. However, the borders are usually the issue of the perception. And here I would add to the discussion that was mentioned before, namely the difference between official histories and historiography, historic science if you wish, is that histories, particularly official histories, are constant reinterpretations from the political and social perspective of historic facts, and particularly their interpretations. And this is why in scholarly circles we can quite easily find consensus on specific historic events, on specific interpretation, though we might share different views on certain specific interpretations. However, when it comes to political discourse, to political mobilization of ethnicity, to political mobilization of history, that's a different story. Then usually some group, some political party, some elite dominates the discourse and makes it exclusive in order to somehow preserve its own monopoly of power. In this context, I would also like to point to the few characteristics of social phenomena in general that I believe are extremely important when we do discuss the issue of ethnicity, particularly considering the fact that ethnicity from the nationalistic perspective is seen as an absolute construct and concept. Namely, all social phenomena, including ethnicity, crisis, conflict, democracy, whichever one you want to think, is actually a process. It is structured, dynamic, complex process that always involves the following dimensions. The first one is relational, social. You need to have at least two individuals, if not actual individuals, then abstract individuals, if you consider Robinson Crusoe on his island and his thoughts of the others, to create and constitute a certain phenomenon, a social one. Secondly, you need to have territorial perspective. And this was one of the perspectives that hasn't been mentioned much, but that in ethnic context actually frequently plays extremely important role, particularly when different ethnic groups are claiming the same territory. And this territory can be the actual material territory, or it can be also abstract, imaginary, imagined territory, mythical territory if you wish. And the third one, which has in a way indirectly been addressed, however we frequently forget about it, and particularly the nationalists too. And this is the temporal dimension, time. Namely, when we consider time, we have to know that each social, but also natural phenomena have their life cycle. They appear, they evolve, and they disappear. And so ethnicity should not be considered as something permanent, but rather as a transitory process that originates in something and will eventually actually transform in something else. Of course, nationalists hate that part of the argument. What again is quite interesting in this context is that actually social phenomena, even though we generalize them, we make them abstract, are actually quite concrete interpretations mostly of what is actually happening in the society. We usually construct those phenomena and concepts. And in this frame, I would like to point that actually when we are speaking of ethnicity, when we are speaking of state, when we are speaking of language, we are usually relating this concept to a particular historic formation that we know and are aware of. But at the same time, we consider it a kind of abstract, universally applicable concept, a model if you wish. On the other hand, particularly when it comes to conflicts, but it also applies to other categories and phenomena that I mentioned, we have to be aware that each phenomenon is actually a specific one, sui generis, if you wish, and that therefore, regardless of the common characteristics, one should also take into account also the specificities and differences that exist. In this context, I would like to add that somehow this is not as unknown as we consider it to be. Namely, when we try to determine ourselves, to identify ourselves, when we ask who am I, we actually would tend to realize relatively soon that we are unique, that we are similar to other persons, but that at least in some characteristics we are specific, and what applies as yardstick to the others cannot be completely and fully applied to us, and that our yardsticks are sometimes slightly different. And now I'm coming to the question that I really wanted to address in more detail, but I'll just briefly comment on it. And the question is, does ethnic conflict per se exist? Is the ethnicity in itself a reason and source of a conflict? And you would find different answers. Primordialists would claim, yes, the mere fact that ethnicity exists is the reason for the conflict. So the moment you have different ethnicities, you will have conflicts. My answer to that is, yes, there is potential for conflicts. However, ethnicity becomes important in the context of social conflict, yet then when it is mobilized by political elites, by movements, social political movements, by political parties as such. At that point, whichever social conflict actually gains its ethnic dimension and in a way transforms into ethnic conflict. Why is this so important? Because once you transform a conflict into ethnic conflict, it gains its emotional and moral dimensions. And you can no longer manage and handle it just rationally, without considering those other dimensions. So is there ethnic conflict per se? My answer to that question would be actually not. However, once we determine a certain conflict as an ethnic one, then it definitely should be treated as such, or otherwise we don't stand much chances in actually managing and resolving it. The question then is, how do we approach the conflicts? And in tradition, basically two approaches have been developed and have evolved. One was conflict management, that was actually focusing on the process and tried to prevent the escalation of the conflict. And the other one was goal-oriented, end-oriented if you wish, that was resolution of conflict. We define what conflict is, we define all sides and everything, we try to rationalize and then come to a common conclusion that will actually resolve the conflict. And mind you, in the 1980s and 1990s, the two schools were actually in severe conflict. And people so much hated each other, they wouldn't even want to sit in the same room, managers and resolutioners. And there were a few individuals who at the time were actually able to cross these borders, mostly for what has been now slightly forgotten for their personal reputation and personal histories, who were actually able to bring those different schools together, and then a new concept, or several new concepts started, of transformation, of conflict management and resolution. And then in the 1990s also the concept of diversity management was actually introduced in the field of social sciences. The concept of diversity management was not new at that time. It was introduced in natural sciences already in the 19th century in the context of managing biodiversity. Basically, if you read Darwin carefully, you will see some references to it already. And it was quite interestingly developed in the field of forestry, because they were dealing with the actually managing of complex biosystems such as forests, and they realized that you cannot do it monodimensionally. You necessarily have to take into account not only trees that are growing there, but also other plants and all the animals, because they all together create a biotop that contributes to the health of the forest, and that increases in turn the production of the wood, which was the main intention they had. When this concept was actually translated into social sciences, and particularly put in ethnic context, and the Balkan situations and some other situations actually contributed to that, basically the following characteristics were raised and stressed as key ingredients of diversity management. And mind you, initially actually the scholars doing that were actually speaking of managing diversities. However, then some bureaucrats at the Commission, European Commission at the time, somewhere found the term diversity management, probably in economy, and they just kind of used it because they thought it sounded nicely. And when the term was once introduced, it was better to simply stick to it than to try to introduce another one that wouldn't be so broadly known and accepted. So, what were these main ingredients? And again, mind you, diversity management, again, is a broad process that should combine all the levels, from the local to the global, and all perspectives from short term to long term. It should be a kind of combined strategy that actually considers not only current developments, but also considers past developments and predicts some possible future developments. And the main contents would be recognition of the existence of pluralism and diversity, and this means of all relevant social dimensions that exist in a society and that might be plural and diverse. Recognition that conflicts deriving from different interests are normal phenomena and should therefore be handled as such, and we all are basically raised and educated that conflicts are something deviant, that we should be afraid of. Namely, they have both negative and positive potentials, and to a large extent it depends on their management, how they're being unfolded. Then the formal recognition and knowledge about those diversities, which can then be managed in possibly democratic ways and within democratic institutions. There are different definitions of diversity management. I will just, and this will be the only part that I will be reading because I don't think I will be able to reproduce it adequately. Namely, one of the definitions that is being used is that diversity management is a permanent process that addresses all relevant issues of diversities and asymmetries in societies. It includes the regulation and management of socially relevant diversities, including the prevention, management, and resolution of crises and conflicts. It requires understanding, recognition, acceptance, and respect of diversity, modes of coexistence and cooperation, sensitivity of people to all factors that might signal escalation of crises or conflicts, and their capability to apply adequate activities and measures which would prevent such an escalation. And then I would add to this that early detection of possible escalation of conflicts is extremely important, as everybody in the community of conflict resolutioners and conflict managers basically agrees that the best chance is to to actually manage or even resolve a conflict exists at the early stage of the conflict. And if the preventive mechanisms and measures are successful, then it is quite likely that the conflict will not escalate. I would actually here like to point to another important element, and this will be the ending of my talk, though I could be speaking much longer, which I consider is quite important from this perspective. And this is how we can actually build upon the traditions. And yes, I agree that there are some extremely positive traditions that have existed in the Baltics, that have existed in the Balkans, that have existed in other parts of the world, that have somehow been forgotten. And I will now use first an example of the Balkans. Today, everybody perceives Bosnia and Herzegovina as a society which is constantly torn by ethnic conflict, to a large extent violent one. As a matter of fact, as late as in the 19th century, Jews prosecuted in Western Europe found their refuge, their safe haven inside it. And not only from southern parts of Western Europe, also some of the problems that occurred somewhere in the north were reflected there, and also these Jewish communities. Mostly they were Sephardic Jews, however, also from the north, some of them fled there. And you see, a society that traditionally was extremely tolerant, it wasn't very democratic, it wasn't always very inclusive, but it was rather tolerant, is now perceived as being one of the most exclusive and torn by ethnic conflict. And mind you, even after ethnic conflict during World War II in this territory, relations in Bosnia and Herzegovina were actually built upon the perception of certain unity. And if there is a certain indicator that can be quite telling, was the fact that the highest share of inter-ethnic marriages actually existed in Bosnia and Herzegovina, everywhere in the world. So after conflict during World War II, still such a development was possible. However, what happened, and here I would like to just refer to what was mentioned earlier by Peter, namely ethnicity in its exclusive, mobilizing sense was used as a political mobilizer in this environment in the lack of other political infrastructure and ideologies that existed there, and was used to divide rather than to unite, as it has been tried in the past. So what I would like to say was that in different parts of the world, actually different patterns of coexistence and cooperation have developed. Not always democratic, not always friendly to individuals, not always friendly to all communities. However, they managed to preserve a relatively stable environment within which compromise was possible, within which contacts and cooperations were possible. And this was extremely important. And quite frequently with the introduction of nation state, and here I will end, that was basically perceived as single nation state. And this is, I believe, the original problem that we need to address. Those mechanisms, those traditions were actually forgotten. Why they were forgotten? Because they were extremely dangerous to exclusivist concept of nation state. They provided for inclusion. They provided for transition of borders. And this from the perspective of nationalistic ideologies that kind of built the concept of single nation state was unacceptable. Because then homogeneity, then national unity, then national interests as they were defined by nationalists were no longer undisputed facts and goals to which everybody should be contributing, but become a way of imposed concept that is basically being used to somehow exclude the others from my own monopoly of power. Of course, I'm a realist. And being a lawyer, I'm totally aware of the fact that we cannot do away with nation states. However, what we can do as scholars is basically that we should start discussing also some failures and some problems that nation states are actually creating. And particularly when it comes to ethnic relations, nation states might be to a certain extent, if they are following civic dimensions, part of the solution. However, as long as every nation state I know in the world is still predominantly ethnic state, they are more a part of a problem and creator of a problem than they are a part of a solution. And here I will stop.
Thank you very much for your comments. Thank you very much for reminding us that ethnicity has its own life cycle, because it seems so deeply ingrained, almost unremovable in our current public discourse. And I would like to make one remark. Of course, I can claim that I'm idealist. That's the fact. But I said the tradition of diversity of a Polish-Lithuanian or Lithuanian-Polish Commonwealth is a myth. Is a myth in which I want to believe, and in fact, in which I do believe. And I think it's a much nicer myth to believe than a myth of a homogeneous society, which, as you rightly pointed out, cannot exist. That will be my very brief remark. I have one question, but perhaps I would like to ask you to ask your questions now. Please, the floor is yours. Our experts.
I have also some questions, but maybe later.
Okay, so just I would propose that we collect, and then I will give the floor to you. Please, Justyna.
I will be first. Okay. So my name is Justyna Adamic. I'm from University of Łódź, Faculty of Law and Administration. I'm a student. And maybe I want to try to review these meetings, because for me it's really important. And my personal experience, according first panel as well as second panel in summary. I will try really in short. And in first presentation, in first panel, you first paper, professor told that Vilnius is tolerant city. That's true. It's still tolerant. And secondly, you also told that there was during the history division between religious conflict, that Orthodox and Catholics. Orthodox, everyone thought that Orthodox were Russian or Belarusian. Catholics, Poles, were Lithuanians. My question, were Lithuanians. I will try to explain in the second part of my presentation, short presentation. And yes, I'm a bit stressed, but I will try my best to explain everything. In second presentation during first panel, professor told that what is the reason to be Lithuanian? The reason to be Lithuanian is freedom. It's freedom because if we know history, I know history very well, and also in second presentation you told that Polish Poles know much more history than Lithuanians. Poland. It was in first or second paper, and maybe I will try to now go to the second panel. Sorry that I mix everything, but I will try to say everything the best I can. So, in summary, today's meeting and also the second panel, but for me was much more important historical review. I want to say that last year I was studying in Maastricht and I became Lithuanian friends. We meet up on the street, and what happens? I feel really alone. And what happens? What happens when they hear that I'm Polish? They talk to me friends. Really, because they heard my accent, my Eastern European accent, and it was a from historical meeting in the heart of Europe, Maastricht, because as we know, Maastricht is the heart of European Union. We met on Brussels Street. We met on Brussels Street. Maybe it's symbolical meeting and also very, very good experience from student point of view on today's meeting. Now I'm not stressed at this moment, so maybe I will speak better. So, and today's also is for me very important impression, because we met today because we feel that is problem, but it's not problem. Really, it's history. And people who knows history, as me, I think that I know a lot, maybe not everything, but a lot, respect everything. And what exactly mean Lithuanian and Polish? Mean both nations. Because during the past, we were one kingdom, but with both nations. So I think that today's meetings and today's problem are just history, because we are friends, and because the issues of everything is integration, and our common history connected us, and there is no problem for my generation, student generation, but it's problem with history that no one knows everything, and older people or adults remember past, and this is problem of this conflict which exactly doesn't exist. So thanks, I know that. I have to finish.
Thank you very much for your very personal remarks.
Yes, this is my personal.
And any other questions? First, Mr. Yevgeny, person of a complicated ethnic background. Mr. Martin, not a requirement. Very complicated ethnic background, and then Professor Zashnov. Questions?
Okay, so my name is Evgeny Akimenko. I'm a law student from Cologne. And first of all, thank you for your both presentations. They were such interesting that you had my full attention. And
That late in the afternoon.
well, you described that ethnic conflicts may become radical, and well, there are such full example like Ireland, like Spain even, and on the other hand there are ethnic majorities which are in dialogue, and they are speaking about their differences. So my question is, well, you speak about the history, about the about that what happens, but my question is, well, the war, the conflict in former Yugoslavia ended 1995, and well, now in Bosnia and Herzegovina there live a generation who still remembers a time where the majorities lived together, and now after 95 there is a new generation of younger people who even doesn't know the old structure, the old country, and who lives now in two different parts, Republika Srpska and Bosnia and Herzegovina. So my question is, what is your expectation? What do you expect from the new generation which live now in this country? So will it become, will it explode like a volcano? Because it's the difference are cooking now in this country, and will it explode? Or on the other hand, will they live in dialogue and maybe build some country of freedom?
Thank you very much for the office.
Thank you. Yeah, my name is Martin Mongas. I'm also from the University of Cologne, also a law student. I'd just like to address Professor van Houten briefly, because, well, you mentioned the Hungarian minority in Romania, and well, I heard about the promotion of the conflict in Romania by the leading Hungarian party, and my question now would be: do you think that it's quite frequent to use ethnic conflicts to utilize them in favor just to promote own political ideas, not just and not actually as a altruistic movement to help their brothers in a foreign nation, but just to promote the inner political ideas. Yes.
Thank you very much, Professor Zasztoft, Dr. Skomerska, and the gentleman in the corner.
I'm from law school, from a law student from Vilnius.
Other way around. Professor It's according to the schedule, so.
I have three questions and one remark. First question is about the kin states. The question is it possible to point out any non-kin state in Europe? This seems a very, very stupid question, but this is from the historian point of view. Non-kin state. There is no minorities of the, let's say, neighboring countries, as far as I understood this definition. So this is the first question to Professor Cotton. And then the question about the time. That's the question to both of you, I think. Because I think that the factor of the time is the most important in these ethnic conflicts. And I can imagine that in, let's say, in future, that might be possible to create an European identity. It's only the question of time. So this is the so what is your time perspective for such a European identity? The third question is to Professor Żagar. Is it possible to rethink the Balkan model, or at least to create any model of Balkan situation? Because as far as I know, I'm not an expert in Balkans, and that this version is so complex and so multi, let's say, levels, politically, ethnically, religiously, and so on, so on. So is it possible to create any political model of the situation? And one remark was that Professor Żagar said that each ethnic conflict ends as an ethnic, and I absolutely disagree. No. My conflict with my wife never ended. That was always economical or social.
May I just, as a point of verification, so that it is not misunderstood, I said that every conflict can be interpreted as ethnic if parties bring that dimension to it, or outside observers, I will add now, because I didn't speak of outside observers before, but the same happens if outside observers actually determine certain conflict as ethnic. I claim that ethnic conflict per se does not exist. I claim that a conflict becomes an ethnic conflict. One ethnicity is being mobilized as a means in a conflict. That was my claim, and I apologize for this unclear presentation if it wasn't clear initially.
Okay, thank you. Please, Dr. Skomerska, I would be thankful for a short question, and then it's.
So I would like to refer to the presentation of Professor Żagar, and I must say that I'm very impressed by this because I really like this approach to the phenomenon of ethnic conflicts as dynamic phenomenon, and also to the identity, this collective and individual identity as something which is quite flexible. And I got one question, because for me the conclusion is that there is a possibility to create cosmopolitan society within national state. Yes? Is it your conclusion? And do you think, because our legal reality, especially in international public law, is based on national state, the state which is connected with ethnic identity, And is it possible to transform it? Whether we are maybe already we are in a period of transformation, because as we can see, the young generation, if I may, is outside this understanding of national state as ethnic community. And what do you think about European identity? Is it possible to create this kind of identity? Because I think that there are two directions of the process, that this small identity, I mean regional one, is stronger and stronger, even more strong than this national identity, and on the other side we've got a new identity, European identity. And how do you see our future social environment, and also what the legal changes should be to make this all change possible? That's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I must admit, I have up to now very seldom experienced European identity, but I quite often did experience Eastern European identity, which is also mine. Please.
So my question is very short. So regarding national politics, national political agenda, what would be your solutions, how to transform support from ethnic parties to conventional parties?
Thank you very much. I would like to finish with questions and give the experts the opportunity to answer. Each of you has 7 minutes. Please, Peter.
Oh, I thought you were going to ask me a question. 7 minutes. Now, hopefully I can do this quicker. We'll start. Maybe a question about the Hungarian that was triggered by the Hungarian minority in Romania, and whether it's usual, but it might be the case that politicians or political elites promote these kind of political agendas for their own purposes. Absolutely, yes, I think is the answer. As most political scientists, I think, are extremely cynical about the motives of most politicians. So I think that that doesn't apply to all, and it is not exclusively one or the other either. I mean, it is, but I think it is true that if you start engaging, particularly in a democratic or any kind of political context, even if you believe strongly in it, you have to care about getting power, and that may require you to do certain things. And I think it is true that in many of these cases, and arguably a good example of this would be Milosevic in Yugoslavia. There was very little evidence before the mid to late 80s that he cared at all about nationalist issues, and then he suddenly became this great nationalist politician, and that seemed to be the route to stay in power. That's one reading of what is going on. So I think yes, but the interesting thing about that is that is also exactly the reason for why this doesn't necessarily need to get out of hand, so to speak, because it might very well, and that was partly what I was referring to when we talked about how party competition comes in, because that kind of instrumental political agenda may not be the route to power, or may not work in certain cases because of competition, because it may not resonate enough with the population. So it is and that is what some of these quote unquote solutions, they're not really solutions, but attempts to do something about it by kind of reshaping kind of electoral systems and reshaping particularly institutional design issues are meant to, the idea is that changes the incentives of politicians of how they kind of mobilize, because in order to win support, and that's also potentially one answer. I'm not sure it works, but one of the answers that a lot of people will give to one of the last questions about how do you get parties to move from like being an ethnic party to a broader one. Some people would argue it is by designing your political systems in ways. So some people say presidential systems can actually potentially help with this, because presidential system is a winner-take-all kind of election, so you have to appeal quite broadly to be able to win. You can put rules into place that essentially make sure that any party or any person come in needs support from various parts of the country if your ethnic groups are territorially concentrated. There's a big literature on that. I'm not sure it always works because these rules don't always work out as you hope that they will. Then there are others that say, take a different track and say, well, ethnic parties as such are not the problem. I mean, as I say, because if they are part of a process, if it's just one voice in a process where other parties compete along other lines and they just have to interact with each other and have to go into coalition with each other if they want to get in government, it's not so much of a problem, and it might actually be better to get these voices heard and be represented in the political system rather than somewhat trying to push them away. But that's what I would say to that question. About the kin state question was interesting. So I hadn't really thought about this. Probably in some kind of historical, I can see how it comes from an historian, from some kind of historical process, it's probably true that you can always point out some population groups that may have links to, now in practice of course it's not always clear. There's a lot of these states, these nation states that have been talked about, and you're developed relatively late, and so it's only by some historical slide that you can say they somehow, part of their population is located in a different territory because they never really controlled it in any way. And what nation states often were about, certainly in Western Europe, was actually going from smaller units and trying to create that nation through explicit policies to do with education, language policy, military subscription, all kinds of the usual factors that people point out. But it is an interesting one. I'm not sure, are there any Spanish living outside Spain? In a way, probably there are. And so it's hard to think of a specific example, but if you can think of an example in a way that just makes my point stronger, which
is no such a state in Europe which is not a non-kin, which is, let's say, non-kin state.
Well, if you accept that,
I don't know. I don't remember in the history, and I don't know now.
Well, that's fine. I mean, that just reinforces the point that having this relation with an outside state that might potentially have some population group that it feels attached to and that it can support isn't necessarily leading to conflict, because if that's true, then it's even stronger. Then it's even more the exception when it happens rather than the rule. Huh? So in that sense, European identity came up in two of the questions. I will start my go at that. It'll be interesting to see what Mitja has to say. It is of course a big question about the EU, and a lot of people saying that's what you actually need for the EU ultimately to function and become fully democratic, and there's a whole debate about that. What we know historically, I think, is that in some cases it can take a long time, and I'll partly refer to, I mean, we may think of France and or as the stereotypical example of a nation state, but that was actually a very difficult process to get this quote-unquote homogeneous state constructed. So that suggests it would take a long time. But on the other hand, and partly gets to your question actually, we also see sometimes quite quick and radical changes of primary identification, at least, and I think former Yugoslavia would be the case for that. Now the tragic bit of that is, I think, and it happens in history, but usually, as far as I can, usually happens when there is conflict, and there is some serious conflict, and that becomes kind of a reason to start identifying different, to mobilize. So I don't think I should promote here that would be a good idea for Europe to get into some major conflict with some other part of the world, but historically, I mean, that is probably what would the best boost to the European identity would be a war with the US or something, but that's not probably such a good idea. So in the absence of that...
We have such idea that we have to introduce war to the United States and then let them get in and stay here.
Well, there's this film with Peter Sellers in the 60s where some very tiny country decides that they have an economic problem and decide the good thing to do is what they do, they invade the state, lose, and then get rebuilt like Germany and Japan and become rich. So maybe that's, that works. So that's, but in the absence of that, I think, but I'm actually not convinced with the premise of this argument, which is that you need this European identity somehow, particularly in some kind of more ethnic type of form, for the EU to work better. But that's another discussion.
Thank you very much.
May I also have 10 minutes?
Yes. Yes, definitely.
Okay. No, that's why I asked, so that I can see whether I can at least attempt to answer all of the questions, or just basically limit to a few. I'll try with all of them. Briefly and in a way of headlines, and later on, if there is interest, we can probably discuss some of the issues a little bit more in detail. The first comment was very interesting. Do these ethnic and other diversities and differences matter for younger generations? Particularly if they consider themselves global and they live to a large extent in virtual reality. In daily life, probably not. However, once they become politically and socially relevant, they will probably play out. And we can see that by the fact that also within ethnic conflict, nationalistic parties, you would also have youth participating and benefiting from such concepts. So I would guess that people are willing to use several concepts, even those they disagree with, as Milosevic did with the nationalism in the 70s and early 80s, when they find them useful. However, nationalism is an extremely dangerous beast. Once you try to ride it, it basically gets hold of you. And you have to be more and more radical to attract the followers. And you can no longer escape. So in a way, you are trapped in your own trap, and you have to follow a certain policy, even you do not believe in it, because it is pragmatically, from your position, seen as something that will benefit you. So my answer to your question would be, it is extremely important to know that, to be aware of the possible dangers and problems that such exclusive concepts might bring, that references to historical hatred and problems might bring, because this might definitely also affect you. And I would suggest, and here I would like to point that social science can never be neutral. As a person, I would act and do everything that is in my power to actually help building the common ground for cooperation and coexistence. So I would try not to ignore the problem if it exists, but rather to fight it. When it comes to the capacity of post-war generations to resolve the problem, I actually have to say that I'm not truly an optimist in this context, referring to Bosnia and Herzegovina. Why? Because in the state of Bosnia and Herzegovina, Federation and the Republic of Srpska, you have, for the time being, no common framework that would actually point to common interests. What the international community did successfully was it stopped conflict. It created a kind of mechanisms that, at least in the short term, did not escalate it again to the level of violent conflict. However, what the international community, as well as all internal actors, failed to do is to create a common framework based upon long-term common interests. The reason why internal factors didn't do so, because particularly national and nationalist elites are actually benefiting from the current situation, and it is not in their interest to create such a common framework, because it would reduce their influence and grasp on power. And the international community failed miserably, in my view, for not recognizing and for not realizing and recognizing that fact, and then doing something to actually address it properly. And what also international community did is, right now we are all focusing on the crisis in Philippines, and we completely forgot about the miserable situation in some other parts, let's say some parts of, let's say Southern Sudan, let's say who now even thinks of Haiti and the problems that people have there after the earthquake. So, I mean, we are always focusing on the current issue and tend to forget everything else. And mind you, in a long term, this accumulates. And I would like to add something that might not seem necessarily related. But actually, I would like to put this in the context of the problem of exclusion of young generations and of increasing unemployment rate of the youth. And if you don't address the problems that exist, if you tend to forget those issues and try to, in a way, only address them separately, I'm afraid that losing the global picture sometimes truly is one of the biggest problems that the humanity is facing this day. We no longer see the global picture. We think that the global grand ideologies and theories are time of the past. And we have produced nothing to replace them and to address such problems as are inclusion of youth, inclusion of the excluded in general, the issue of climate changes and so on. I would agree with the issue of in-states. Every state in Europe is ethnically, culturally, religiously plural. Iceland was considered to be a relatively homogeneous one, however, the new statistics show that it no longer is. And I'm not aware of any other that even claimed to be such, though nationalists and political elites frequently do so. I mean, just think of your own cases of Poland, Lithuania, Germany at certain points, and how certain leaders were claiming Lithuania for Lithuanians, Germany for Germans, Poland for Poles. And quite frequently, this was not only internally oriented, but was also in a way hegemonic, because it also included our kin living on the other side of the border. And Anschluss and the reaction in Sudetenland was just one historic example of that. In the past, you have several of them. On the other hand, you also have the cases of clear-cut genocide, for example, how the colonizers handled some issues, for example, how the native populations were handled in North America, how Aborigines were treated in Australia, and so on. So this concept of exclusivity and homogeneity was somehow deeply inserted in our brain and in our patterns of thought, particularly through educational system and socialization. So I think quite frequently when we discuss those issues, we kind of tend to confuse ideal models with the actual reality. And we tend to believe that something that is spread by political ideologies, by the educational system and so on, is actually the reality. Homogeneous nation states have never been the reality. They have just been the projections of those that were pursuing them. The Balkans, I'll try to do briefly at the end. Now
it's impossible to do it briefly.
It is. Because now I would like to address the issue of European identities. And there were quite a few questions. And I would like to say that, first of all, I wouldn't want to use singular. I mean, I don't believe in a single European identity. I believe in European identities that overlap, coexist, sometimes collide and conflict, but that all together are in a way, well, let's call them, hopefully in the path of transformation into inclusive processes. Where do I see the problem now? I don't see the problem that much in further expansion of the EU, even though politically it will take some time. Where I see the main problem right now is the problem of Fortress Europe in relation to the others. Demographically speaking, Europe cannot survive at its present level of living standard without constant inflow of immigrants. And this will require quite a substantive redefinition of our perception of what European is. It means that Asians, Africans, and all the others not only have historically been part of our tradition, but are also part of our future. And we were just joking over lunch, and I said there that basically we are all just colony of Africa, because our predecessors basically expanded all over the world from Africa. But from present-day historic perspective, nobody wants to interpret historic development that way. But humankind actually originates from there. Genetically speaking, we know that we are a kind of descendants of some 1,500 individuals at some point in time. The scientists still argue whether this was 50 to 70,000 years ago or maybe 120,000 years ago. So what I would argue for would be the concept of pluralism of European identities. There are simultaneous, there are overlapping, that are compatible, that would build not only upon ethnic and cultural issues, but also on local, regional, and so on. And again, Europeans actually sense this feeling of European identity once we are placed to some other environments in the world. And then we see that probably we share more with Dutch and Polish and Italian and other co-Europeans than we do, let's say, with, WASP in America, who was there for 10 generations. And interestingly enough, what I also found quite fascinating was the fact that some of other immigrants actually joined in because they saw they are closer to this logic than they are to some other logic that exists there, and this in a kind melted identity. Now the question of the Balkans and this also relates to the issue of transformation of party support, of ethnic parties into mainstream parties. I think we are addressing the problem from the wrong perspective, posing that kind of answers. And since this is basically graduate and doctoral course, I think I could do that without, I'll try to be short. Namely, you see, we are all presuming that wonderful models and concepts and theories that we are using are the actual reality, or at least adequate reflections of reality. As a matter of fact, they are miserable, and I will deliberately use this term, approximations, rather than anything else. They don't truly reflect the reality. However, our mindset, our way of thinking is framed by them. We are trapped in those traps. Let me try to explain this in a very simple terms. Is it really relevant whether a party support goes to minority or to majority parties in a certain society? I would say no, if those parties would actually consider common good. The moment those parties act divisively and try to benefit on the expense of the others, that becomes a problem. And then the solution is not to transfer voters from minority parties to majority parties or mainstream parties, because they will still act exclusively. They still won't be considering what is actually common good, because in common good of mainstream parties, frequently minorities are seen as a problem, because they complicate the process and make it far more complex and costly. I think the costliest approach, actually in the long term, is to ignore this or to marginalize minorities and place them in the situation where they have to rebel. I mean, just imagine, what do you do with a suicide bomber? When a person is brought to that situation that one is willing to risk one's life, will the fear of persecution be a good preventive mechanism? Probably not. And what I would also like to say is the fact that we in social sciences believe we have methodologies that can basically help us research everything. When it comes to identity, when it comes to ethnicity, the mechanisms, the methodologies, the yardsticks that we have are completely inadequate to a large extent. Best we can do is we can analyze some segments and describe phenomena. We almost always fail in predicting developments. Why so? Because our models actually are built on the concept of dependent and independent variables. As a matter of fact, all variables that we are dealing with, that are much more numerous than we can even think of, are basically dependent variables. And we cannot even calculate a formula with only unknown quantities and dependent variables. So our presumption that a certain variable is an independent variable is already our reduction of the perception of the situation. We don't know better, so I'm using the same concept. What I'm saying is just don't take what is actually coming out from your computation as the reflection of the reality. It is just your interpretation, your small slice of reality that you might be able to explain to a certain extent. Of course, I don't explain that to undergraduates and to master students usually, but here it is a doctoral seminar, and I think it is good that we actually also address some of those issues. So can Balkan be actually used as a model? In a way, yes. And why so? Because it constantly functions in a situation where all the states are considered failed states, where everything is considered to be non-functional, and people still find their ways to survive.
Sometimes they live on a very good level.
Yeah, sometimes they can actually provide for a reasonably decent existence. In a situation that is completely unstable and that for somebody living in Germany would be a nightmare. Or even for somebody living in Slovenia would be a nightmare.
I would love to live on
I love Balkans as well. What I'm trying to say is sometimes what we are truly limited with is our perspective. And I mean, as a scholar, I like my models, I like my concepts, I like my methodologies, but at the same time, dealing with practical conflicts in different parts of the world, dealing with daily situations, I figured out that theoretical models could be marvelous. However, you always have to adjust them to a specific situation and to specific circumstances. And this is also the answer to the issue how we can probably regulate, sometimes in the future, European environment so that it would be, in a way, stimulative to creation of such inclusive identities. I believe we can, when we actually open it to inflows and to new ideas that maybe we at a certain point might even fear and find frightening. However, in the future, we might find that only this is positive. If we are going to isolate Europe in the fortress Europe, I think it's a lost game already.
Thank you very much. I will need 30 minutes for my concluding remarks. I will not do that, but please, just 1 minute of Thanksgiving. First of all, thank you to you all that you preferred our academic talk to the beautiful weather outside. Then I would like, and I think I can speak also on your behalf, to express my sincere thanks to our experts, to Leszek Zasztow, to our Bohemian Egidius Aleksandrovich, to Peter Van Houten and to Mitya Żagar. We are honored that you accepted our invitation and we enjoyed your presentations very much, and I think we have also learned really a lot. I would like also to express my thanks to the Lithuanian Ministry of Culture, Lithuanian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the University of Łódź, and the Polish House in Vilnius for supporting our event, and also for the Otto Wolff Stiftung, for the Otto Wolff Foundation, which positively decides on every application I submit. And very final remark, we were talking about ethnic identity. I would like to say one word on corporate identity. This is a tie which displays a coat of arms of the University of Cologne. And I am very proud to wear it. And I would like to ask Vaidas, do you like my tie?
Yes, I do.
So you can have it. Thank you all. Goodbye and have a nice evening.